The night before the battle, our camp command tent felt more like a drunken feast than a war room. Baron Reed stood at the entrance with a confident smile, asking if we were ready for combat. Around the grease-stained tables, the barons landed knights and squires laughed, drank ale, and bragged about how easily they would crush the Vikings. Everyone treated the threat as a minor nuisance, expecting only a single longship and a dozen pirates who would flee at the sight of our force. Sitting quietly near the back, I drank my ale and kept my hopes to myself. I was Adrian, a landless knight in my early 20s. For 3 years, I had served the Baron through skirmishes, bandit hunts, and caravan escorts without earning true distinction. While the other men already had their own manners, I had nothing. To me, this battle was my golden opportunity. I dreamed of slaying several invaders, earning the Baron's favor, and finally being granted a small riverside village of my own. The next morning, we marched toward the coast through the cold mud of early spring. I stood in the battle line beside my young, nervous squire, while Baron Reed and his armored cavalry took their positions on the high ground behind us. Then, the sea began to darken. Instead of a single raiding party, dozens of Viking longships with carved beast heads emerged across the entire horizon. My squire began to tremble as the massive fleet rowed toward the beach. I tried to calm him, telling him that we only needed to hold the line until the Baron led the cavalry charge down from the ridge. The Viking ships scraped against the shallow sand, and massive warriors in fur coats stood up with giant battle axes raised high. Just as I gripped the hilt of my sword, a desperate shout broke out across the ranks. The Baron had abandoned us. I turned around and saw the high ground completely empty. The cavalry had fled without striking a single blow. Panic spread through our ranks in an instant. The formation broke completely as men shoved, trampled one another, and scrambled to run for their lives while the Vikings stormed the beach. The Baron and his mounted cavalry had fled completely, leaving behind an abandoned infantry of peasants in rusted gear. Surrender was not an option. We were not wealthy lords who could pay a ransom in silver, and falling into pagan hands meant immediate execution. Panic consumed the ranks as the Viking warriors closed in, cutting down anyone in their path. The desperate crowd shoved and trampled each other, rushing toward the dense woods to the east. I knew following the mob meant disaster. Grabbing my trembling squire by the collar, I pulled him away from the chaos and led him north along the edge of the line. The northern route led toward open ground, so nobody else went that way. We moved quickly, avoiding the panic, and reached a gentle downward slope, leading to an old dry riverbed covered in pebbles and withered grass. We stayed low and followed the riverbed west. The earthen walls muffled the brutal sounds of battle and screams from the beach, allowing us to circle around behind the tree line without fighting through the crowd. Eventually, the riverbed brought us up near a sparse birch forest, right beside our campsite from the night before. The camp was completely deserted. No soldiers or Vikings were in sight. Knowing we needed supplies to survive on our own, I told my squire to search the abandoned area quickly. While listening closely for approaching danger, we scavenged through the cold ashes and collapsed tents. My squire found a water skin and a small bulging cloth bag. Near a dead campfire, I discovered half a loaf of hard rye bread, which was still soft enough in the center to eat, and broke it to share with him. At the edge of the camp, my squire waved me over to a wooden post where someone had abandoned a pickaxe and a sickle. Both tools were slightly worn, but still completely usable. I tucked the pickaxe and sickle into my belt, handed my squire an old blanket and some hemp ropes, and gathered our meager haul. With a little food, water, and vital tools secured, I led us straight into the birch forest to find safety. At the edge of the birch forest, I stopped to rest my sore hand and looked across the barren hills. My squire, Alfred, asked which direction we should take. North led back to Baron Reed's fortified estate, but returning made no sense. A lord who abandoned his own infantry in the face of slaughter could not be trusted, and arriving as a survivor would only make me a threat to him. I made up my mind to never go back. Instead, I turned our sights south toward Mercia and Wessex. Down there, beyond the reach of the Vikings, lords still needed swords, and land was waiting to be worked. As long as I kept my armor and blade, I remained a wandering knight in search of an honorable employer. When Alfred asked what lay ahead, I told him that knighthood stayed with a man until death, and he quietly pledged to remain my loyal squire. We marched across the desolate, early spring hills for hours, driven forward by the northern wind and the faint stench of distant smoke. As the late afternoon sun dipped behind the ridge, we rested beneath a tree beside a clear, shallow stream. We shared cold water and small pieces of our hard rye biscuit. Looking at Alfred, I realized it had been 3 years since he first began serving me as an inexperienced boy. Now he carried his weapon with true resolve. As twilight faded into dark, we pushed past a second, steeper ridge and descended into a deep valley. Below lay a sheltered flat beach, lined with fresh wild grass, thick forests, and running water. It was the perfect spot to make camp for the night. Alfred set down his sickle and gathered dry firewood to build a warm campfire by the stream. Sitting against a tree trunk with my weapon and pickaxe close at hand, I watched Alfred tend to the rising sparks. He asked if the Southern Lords would accept us. I assured him that in times like these, men who know how to fight are always in demand. Late in the night, as our campfire began to die down, the sound of footsteps on the riverbed pebbles broke the silence of the valley. 3 Viking warriors emerged from the darkness. Their leader was a tall man with a scarred brow and a braided beard, armed with a short axe. Behind him followed 2 fighters, one wielding a long-handled axe and the other carrying a single-handed axe and a round shield. Seeing our dying embers, they drew their weapons and closed in. Realizing there was no way to escape, I stepped out from the shadows and attacked first. I struck at Scarface's wrist, forcing him back and creating an opening. Alfred immediately charged in, using his sword to harass Scarface before rolling away to tie down the warrior with the long-handled axe. I was left fighting both Scarface and the second invader. Outmatched in pure strength, I used the campfire and surrounding trees to prevent them from flanking me. I parried blows, landed a heavy kick, and bashed the second warrior's face with my sword hilt after his axe tore through my ribs' chainmail. Hearing Alfred shout in distress, I saw him forced down onto one knee in the freezing stream. Scarface and the other warrior pressed me, but I feinted toward an enemy's face, broke free, and charged into the water. I slammed my shoulder into the warrior towering over Alfred, knocking him into the creek. Pinning him under the water, I thrust my blade beneath his leather armor, ending his life. Soaked and weighed down by wet armor, I helped Alfred up, but Scarface and the remaining warrior immediately closed in to surround us. I ordered Alfred to turn and run south, but he refused to leave my side. Scarface came at me with full force, his heavy axe strike forcing me to slide the blade off and cut his leather sleeve. At the same time, the one-handed axe fighter circled around to strike Alfred. Instead of fleeing, Alfred boldly met him, stabbing the raider in the thigh. The wounded Viking retaliated with a heavy blow that struck Alfred's left forearm, breaking the bone and leaving his arm limp. Despite the severe injury, Alfred refused to back down, gripping his sword tightly in his right hand and lunging back into the fight. I kept my full attention on Scarface, dodging his short axe and slashing his wrist to break his rhythm. Closing the distance, I smashed my sword hilt into his face, forced him down into the stream, and wrenched his axe free, letting the rushing water wash it away. He reached for a dagger, but my follow-up strike knocked it from his grip before he could draw it. Nearby, a heavy thud marked the fall of the second raider. Alfred had driven his sword straight through the man's chest, winning his duel. However, Alfred was spent. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, and fresh blood poured from a head wound, forcing him down on one knee in the current. Seeing both of his companions dead, Scarface roared in fury. I seized the opening and drove my arming sword deep into his ribs, causing him to drop his dagger. Knowing he could not survive, the wounded raider grabbed me in a desperate death grip and dragged me backward toward the edge of a drop-off. The stream plunged into a dark, rocky mountain gorge below. Scarface lost his footing at the cliff's edge. He tried to hold on to me, but his fingers tore the chainmail from my shoulder. Together, we tumbled off the ledge into the abyss. As I fell, I heard Alfred's desperate cries echo from above, quickly drowned out by the roar of the water. My back slammed violently into rock. A flash of white light blinded me, and everything went black. When I finally opened my eyes, I was lying half submerged on a muddy riverbank. My head pounded and my ribs throbbed with every breath, but my fingers still moved. I was alive. As I lay there, my mind was flooded with a strange, overwhelming presence. I retained all my memories as Adrian, including the cowardice of Baron Reed, the beach ambush, Alfred's loyalty, and the fall into the ravine. Yet another life entirely had merged into my head. I saw memories of a modern world with electric lights, glowing screens, cell phones, and advanced knowledge. Two distinct lifetimes now existed as one within me. I was no longer merely a wandering knight bound to swords, horses, and the whims of lords. In this new mind were vast concepts of advanced farming, engineering, road building, and ironworking. I had the tools to build a completely different future. Reaching down to my belt, I felt the familiar weight of my sword still strapped to my side, ready for whatever lay ahead. I lay on the muddy riverbank, waiting for the pounding pain in my head to subside before attempting to sit up. A sharp agony ripped through my left shoulder. Looking down, I saw my chainmail torn apart and the linen lining soaked through with dark blood. Beneath it, a nasty 2-inch cut had split the flesh in my shoulder socket. Moving caused fresh blood to seep out, but I slowly dragged myself up to a drier earthen slope and leaned against a dead tree. Looking upstream toward the silent forest, I thought of Alfred. He had been left behind with a broken arm, a wounded leg, and a bloodied face. I had no idea how far the rushing water had carried me, nor if my loyal squire was still alive. Helpless to reach him, I focused on my own survival. My stomach burned with hunger and my throat tasted of blood. Using knowledge from both of my memories, I recognized wild dandelion greens and small bulbs of wild garlic growing along the riverbank. I pulled myself up, washed the plants in the river, and forced them down to curb the hollow ache in my belly, despite the bitter, spicy burn. Next, I checked my gear. My scabbard was gone, but my nicked arming sword remained intact. The short axe, pickaxe, and sickle were still tightly secured to my belt. My dented helmet remained functional, and the leather pouch taken from the dead Viking raider still held silver pennies and a small silver chunk. Tucking my injured left arm into my belt to ease the strain on my shoulder, I marched downstream across the slick pebbles. At a river bend, I spotted a battered dark red round shield caught in a pile of drift branches. It had cuts across the surface, but it was sturdy enough. I strapped it across my back to avoid aggravating my torn shoulder. As night fell and the forest thickened, exhaustion overwhelmed me. I settled into the exposed roots of a large tree, using the shield to lift my body off the cold, damp ground. Warm blood seeped from my shoulder once more, but I forced myself to rest, keeping my right hand clamped onto the hilt of my sword. In my light, restless sleep, the faint crunch of dead leaves deep within the dark forest snapped my eyes open. The light, hesitant rustling of dead leaves grew closer. These were not the heavy, careless stomps of a Viking warrior, but the cautious steps of someone barefoot or in thin sandals. Gritting my teeth against the throbbing ache in my left shoulder, I pushed myself up from the ground. I left the heavy round shield behind, drew my arming sword with my right hand, and crept silently through the morning mist toward the noise. Peeking from behind an oak tree, I spotted a hunched, middle-aged peasant, dressed in a ragged linen shirt, clutching a small bundle of dry firewood. When he looked up and saw me, the color completely drained from his face. He dropped the firewood in terror, tripped backward over a root, and immediately dropped to his knees. Pressing his forehead into the mud and dead leaves, the terrified serf begged for mercy. He assumed I was a lord whose private forest he had trespassed upon, and pleaded for me to punish him rather than his family. Suppressing my pain and impatience, I spoke slowly and calmly to reassure him. I told him that I had not come to collect rents, demand forced labor, or punish anyone. I explained that I was merely scouting for nearby Vikings and had come to check on the noise. Relieved, the man raised his head and revealed that he came from Blackthorn village. He pointed downstream along the river, explaining that the settlement was about half a day's walk away. When I asked if the village had a blacksmith or doctor to treat my injuries, he shook his head. He explained that their small hamlet only had 7 or 8 households, and getting metal tools repaired required traveling 2 or 3 days to Baron Bolton's fortress. Noticing my mangled chainmail and blood-soaked shoulder, the peasant cautiously made an offer. He mentioned that while they had no proper physician, his wife had sewing needles and had previously stitched wounds for villagers. Seeing the rough honesty in the man, I accepted his help and agreed to follow him back to his village. Following the wood-gatherer, we soon arrived at his village, tucked into the valley. It was a poor, dilapidated hamlet of only 7 or 8 low wooden huts with rotting thatched roofs and cracked mud walls. My sudden appearance terrified the peasants. A woman dropped her firewood and fled inside. A field worker ran for cover, and parents dragged their children behind closed doors. Within moments, the entire settlement went completely still. The wood gatherer asked me to wait while he stepped into a hut. Moments later, a frail, gray-haired elder emerged leaning on an oak cane. Bowing with great respect, he greeted me and asked what brought me there. I told him I was simply passing through and asked for food, water, and help with my wound. The old man nodded and quickly brought me a steaming earthenware bowl of peasant porridge. It was a gritty mash of rye paste and undercooked wild vegetables, but the hot meal brought much-needed strength back to my weakened body. The wood gatherer then returned with a needle and rough hemp thread, offering to stitch my cut since his wife was too afraid to come out. Inspecting the thread, I saw it was dirty, uneven, and covered in dust. Realizing that sewing unsterilized thread into my flesh would only cause a fatal infection, I refused the stitches and asked for clean cloth instead. The man went back into his hut and reluctantly brought out an old, faded linen shirt, explaining that it was his wife's finest garment. The fabric was thin from frequent washing, but it was clean and free of mold. Using my teeth and hands, I tore the shirt into several long, neat strips. I thoroughly rinsed the mud and dried blood from my shoulder with fresh water until the runoff was clear. Then, I carefully bound the cut myself. I crossed and knotted the cloth strips tightly around my chest and shoulder socket, creating a firm bandage that pulled the edges of the wound together and stopped the bleeding. After ensuring the dressing was secure, I packed the leftover cloth into my pocket. I then pulled my chainmail back over my torso and fastened my belt, feeling far more stable and prepared to keep going. The serf asked if my wounds had come from fighting the Vikings. I told him plainly that I had encountered 3 in a valley, killed 2 of them, and fallen down the ravine. Hearing this, the village elder whispered something to the man, who hurried inside and brought out half a loaf of rye bread and a piece of dry cheese. He explained that the village chief's son had been conscripted the previous year to defend Mercia from pagans, but had never returned. Learning of our location, I asked if we were truly in Mercia. The man confirmed that Blackthorn village lay within the territory of Baron Bolton. The rushing river had carried me far from Northumbria across the southern border. When I asked about Baron Bolton's attitude toward wandering knights, the peasant looked terrified and admitted he knew nothing. He did explain the surrounding geography. Heading south along the road led to a market town, and further south stood Baron Bolton's fortress, which guarded the crossroads between Worcester and Lincoln. This confirmed we were on the remote, mountainous northeast fringe of Mercia, days away from the Baron's seat. The area was so isolated that tax collectors visited only once a year, and Viking scouts rarely bothered coming here. A bold plan formed in my mind. Rather than offering my sword to an unknown lord who might turn me away, I decided to establish my own secret settlement in this neglected wilderness. The flat riverbank where I had washed ashore was ideal. It had a ridge protecting it from northern winds, a dense forest to the south, clean water, and fertile ground. I would clear the timber, build shelter, and take in wandering refugees fleeing the northern invasions. If questioned later, I would claim the land as a holy knight, reclaiming abandoned soil from the pagan threat. Before departing, I asked the serf for his name. He introduced himself as Blazer. I pointed back toward the sheltered riverbank, upstream, and told him that if his village ever needed protection from danger, they could find me across the water. Overwhelmed with gratitude, Blazer bowed low, knowing that a seasoned knight nearby was far better protection than any distant baron could ever offer. I asked Blazer if the village had any spare wheat or cabbage seeds to spare. Blazer hesitated, explaining that the baron had taken most of their harvest the previous year. What little wheat remained was reserved for their own survival. Though several households had cabbage seeds stored away, the village elder stepped forward and warned me that clearing wilderness, this late in spring, would likely ruin a wheat harvest. But I knew I could survive on cabbage, river fish, and forest game while preparing the ground. Convinced of my resolve, the elder sent Blazer to gather what they could. Blazer first returned with a clay jar filled with dry cabbage seeds collected from the villagers. After another nod from the elder, Blazer fetched a small burlap sack containing about 2 or 3 pounds of valuable wheat seed. I secured the seed jar and burlap bag to my waist. Then, I opened the leather pouch taken from the fallen Viking warrior, took out 3 silver pennies, and placed them into Blazer's hand. Blazer tried to refuse the payment, but I closed his fingers over the coins. I told him the silver would serve them well. and added that once I established my settlement, the villagers were welcome to join me or stay as they pleased. To these impoverished peasants, 3 silver coins were a fortune that could buy essential salt or clothing. Leaving the village behind, I followed the dirt path back into the woods under the rising moonlight. I traveled upstream along the riverbank for about an hour until I reached the bend where the valley opened up. The ground before me was sheltered by a northern mountain ridge, backed by thick southern forests and nourished by the shallow river. The Viking invaders were still occupied with looting northern coastal monasteries and ports, meaning this isolated valley would remain safe from their longships at least through the winter. Sitting against an old oak tree, I set my seeds down and prepared to build my new domain. Over the next few days, I focused on healing my wounds and building a livable campsite. Using fallen tree trunks leaned against the rock face, I wove branches together and stuffed the gaps with moss and dry grass. I thatched the low roof with layered ferns to shed the rain and raised the floor with pebbles and dry grass to stay off the damp ground. Every morning, I carefully cleaned and redressed my shoulder wound with fresh linen strips. The swelling receded and the cut began to close on its own. I spent my daylight hours gathering food. I stunned fish in the river using heavy stones, keeping the large ones and returning the rest. Outside the shelter, I built a stone hearth and slowly smoked the fish over low heat until the skins turned dark brown and hard as bark. I also gathered dandelions, wild garlic, and berries. Within a few days, rows of smoked fish hung from the shelter beams alongside bags of dried greens and wild fruit. I decided not to start farming yet. Clearing land alone was too exhausting for my recovering shoulder and offered small, slow returns. Instead, the surrounding wilderness was rich with red deer and wild boars. Hunting large game would provide valuable jerky, tanned hides, and fat. I could trade these goods in the southern market towns for essential items I could not produce myself, like iron nails, tools, and linen. However, a serious problem arose. Eating the bland smoked fish made me realize that my salt supply had washed away when I fell into the river. Without salt, my strength would fade, and my body would heal far too slowly. The nearest market town was days away, and I could not afford to abandon my new shelter so soon. To solve this, I used my knowledge to extract alkali salt from wood ash. I gathered the fine white ash from my fireplace, sifted out the charcoal slag, and mixed the powder with river water. I poured the strained liquid into a shallow stone hollow under the warm sun. Once the moisture evaporated, it left behind a thin, astringent, grayish-white crust with a distinct salty taste. I carefully scraped this alkali residue into my leather pouch. While it was only enough for a pot of soup, it would sustain me until I could find salty wild sumac berries deeper in the forest, or trade for real salt at the market. I searched both sides of the river for wild sumac trees to harvest salty berries, but found none. Putting the salt search aside, I turned my full focus toward hunting. The game near the riverbank was far more abundant than I had imagined. Every morning, the soft mud by the water was covered in overlapping tracks of red deer, roe deer, wild boars, and the occasional wolf. All the animals in the forest came to drink from this river, meaning I did not have to wander deep into the woods to find them. I scouted the area and discovered a well-trodden animal trail, winding out of the hazel woods toward the water. Upwind from this trail, about 20 paces away, I piled stones into a low mound behind wild blackberry bushes. From this hidden vantage point, I could watch every beast that passed by, while staying completely concealed. In these lands, common serfs were forbidden from hunting large game. In a lord's forest, every deer and boar belonged to the nobility, and serfs caught poaching faced public hanging by forest rangers. However, as an anointed knight, the law treated me differently. Even without a current lord or fief, I was a free man with noble standing. Under Mercian law, taking game without permission was merely a property dispute resolved by compensation, not a hanging offense. Still, the practical challenge remained. I had no proper bow and only possessed a fire-hardened wooden spear. Throwing a crude spear from 20 paces made hitting a vital spot nearly impossible, and a wounded 200-pound stag could easily run half a mile. Close-quarters combat was even more dangerous, as a wild boar's tusks or a stag's antlers could easily kill an armed man. To bring down large game safely without risking severe injury, I realized I could not rely on thrown spears or melee combat. The only sensible way forward was to dig a pit trap directly along the animal trail. I took my pickaxe and began digging at the narrowest section of the animal trail. First, I carefully peeled away the surface turf and set the intact patches aside to use later as camouflage. Underneath, I dug through the rich humus into the rocky sand, despite a sudden pang in my recovering left shoulder from hauling out a heavy buried boulder. I kept working until the pit reached the depth of my thighs. At the bottom of the trap, I prepared 6 solid wooden stakes. I shaved one end of each stake into a sharp 4-sided point, charred the tips over hot coals to make them rock hard, and drove them deep into the soil in 2 secure rows. Any large beast falling into the pit would impale its underbelly on the upright points, and its frantic struggles would only cause it to bleed out faster. To cover the pit, I wove a flexible lattice of dry branches across the opening. I tested the frame with my hands, making sure it was sturdy enough to support the turf without collapsing, yet weak enough to break under a deer's heavy weight. Then, I placed the sod back over the branches, filled the cracks with dirt, and scattered withered leaves across the surface, until the ground looked completely undisturbed. Forest game possessed sharp senses, so I had to erase every trace of human scent. I sprinkled my alkaline wood ash salt across the disturbed earth to absorb sweat odors. Then, I crushed pungent wild garlic and rubbed the spicy juice onto nearby bush branches, tree trunks, and surrounding rocks. The sharp garlic aroma completely masked my presence. For bait, I used a pot of crushed blackberries and raspberries that had fermented into a sweet, wine-like mash. I dripped the fragrant juice, leading along the trail straight to the center of the trap. The sweet scent would pique a passing deer's curiosity and cause it to lower its head, guiding its hooves directly onto the hidden drop. Finally, I prepared a concealed blind upstream among the raised roots of an old oak tree. I reinforced the spot with stones, creating a sheltered hideout where I could watch the trap without being seen. This kept me close enough to dispatch any trapped animal quickly before the scent of fresh blood could attract the forest's prowling wolf packs. After a full day of waiting patiently, a loud cry from the trap woke me early the next morning. I grabbed my short axe and crept through the shadows to investigate. The branch cover had collapsed into the pit, and inside lay a trapped roe deer. 2 wooden stakes had pierced its hind leg and belly. It was smaller than a full-grown red stag, but it was still a solid 70 to 80 pounds of fresh meat and useful resources. I dropped into the pit, took hold of the struggling deer, and quickly ended its suffering with a clean strike to the throat. Gritting my teeth against the strain on my wounded shoulder, I hauled the carcass out of the pit and began field dressing it immediately. Leaving a blood trail on the path to camp would only draw the forest wolves. I skinned the deer carefully with my axe, keeping the hide intact so it could eventually be dried and cured for boots or a hat. Then, I carved out the heart to eat, first before they spoiled. I removed the prized tenderloins along the spine, dislocated all 4 legs, and stripped the remaining meat from the ribs, neck, and backbone. I also saved the 2 small antlers, which could easily be sharpened into drill heads, needles, or arrow points. Because 70 pounds of venison was too heavy to carry all at once, I split the harvest into 2 loads. On my first trip, I rushed the 4 legs and rolled pelt back to camp, concealing them beneath dry grass inside the shelter. Returning for the second load, I frightened off a few birds pecking at the discarded bones, grabbed the rib meat and offal, and hurried back to base. Back at the campsite, I spread the hide over a flat stone, scraped away the fat, and left it to dry in the sun. I stoked the fire in my stone stove and sliced the fresh liver into bite-sized pieces. Skewering the meat on twigs, I roasted it over the glowing charcoal. Seasoned with a pinch of my wood ash salt, the fresh liver was rich, tender, and nourishing. It provided the vital energy I needed as night fell over the riverbank. I cut the remaining deer meat into strips and arranged them on the rack above the stone hearth to slowly smoke them into durable jerky. In the distance, wolf howls echoed through the valley. As planned, the wolves were feasting on the discarded entrails and cleaned carcass near the trap, rather than following the blood trail back to my camp. Hoping to catch a larger beast, I dug 2 more pit traps along the animal trail. I placed one upstream near the forest bend and the other downstream along the bank. Every morning, I carefully checked all 3 traps, refreshing the crushed wild garlic and berry mash to mask my scent and draw in prey. Days passed without success. Examining the mud around the original trap, I noticed that the animal tracks had grown scarce. The distinct hoofprints of a large buck showed that it had stopped paces away and turned back toward the woods. Even though I had replaced the stakes and covered the bloodied mud with fresh soil, the lingering scent of death, combined with my own sweat and smoke, had alarmed the sensitive deer. I realized the animals would avoid this path until heavy rains cleared the odors. Instead of idling, I focused on crafting gear from my roe deer harvest. The sun-dried pelt had turned pale yellow and was soft to the touch. It was not thick enough for armor, but it was ideal for a warm inner garment. Using my axe, I scraped off the remaining fat and smoothed the underside. I took out the 2 needles I had carved from the deer's antlers and threaded them with coarse hemp twine. I sliced the hide in 2 along the spine, measuring 1/2 against my chest and the other across my back. Using the bone needles, I firmly stitched the shoulder seams together, leaving wide openings under the armpits for free arm movement. The result was a sturdy, sleeveless leather vest with the soft fur turned inward. I discarded my filthy, blood-stained linen undershirt and put on the new vest. The fur was warm and comfortable against my healing skin. When I pulled my chainmail back over my torso, the soft leather absorbed the bite of the heavy iron links and completely blocked the cold mountain wind. Finally, I tore the cleaner parts of my old linen shirt into strips and saved them in my pouch for bandages, handle wraps, or fire tinder. The red stag never returned, but my traps soon caught a new prize. An adolescent wild boar had fallen into one of the pits. It was trapped between the stakes, its thick, tough hide preventing the points from piercing its belly. Knowing how dangerous a thrashing boar can be, I stayed above the rim and drove my arming sword straight behind its ear to kill it cleanly. The carcass weighed at least 120 pounds. The dense hide, fangs, bristles, and fat offered immense value. I field dressed the boar on the spot, carrying the meat, hide, and fat back in 2 loads while leaving the offal for the forest wolves. Back at the campsite, my shelter was growing dangerously full. Smoked meat, dried greens, jars of seeds, and tools were stacked everywhere. The exposed camp felt vulnerable to prowling beasts and intruders. To secure my hard-earned provisions, I spent several days cutting thick wooden stakes, driving them into the soil, and weaving strong vines between them to build a sturdy protective fence around my shelter. Next, I worked on crafting armor from the boar hide. Lacking lime or saltpeter, I gathered oak bark and boiled it down to extract rich tannins. I soaked the tough pigskin in the dark tannin broth for an entire day until it became soft and supple. I cut the cured hide into front and back breastplates, stitching them firmly at the shoulders with hemp twine. Worn beneath my chainmail, this thick leather vest provided excellent padding and double protection against heavy blades. I also began constructing a proper hunting bow. Combining soaked roe deer tendons with flexible wild boar sinew, I twisted multiple strands together and wrapped them tightly with linen thread to make a durable bowstring. For the bow stave, I chopped down a straight ash tree, split a 5-foot section down the center, and set the wood against the rock wall to cure in the shade. Once properly dried, this ash stave would give me a reliable 40-pound hunting bow to strike game from a distance. Persistent spring rain seeped through the rock face and soaked my crude bedding into a cold, sour mess. Waking up to ruined hay and muddy ground, I knew sleeping on the floor was no longer an option. I gathered logs from a fallen oak, laid them across the depression above the damp earth, and layered them with pine needles and dry moss. It provided a dry bunk for the night, but rising ground moisture meant I needed a permanent cabin. I decided to build a proper wooden shelter, using the 8-foot rock face as a natural, sturdy back wall to save timber. I went into the forest and chopped down 3 thick, straight trees. Dragging the heavy trunks back took immense effort, leaving my shoulders bruised and hands blistered. Over the next few days, I prepared the timber. I cut the trunks into upright pillars and crossbeams, stripping the bark to use later as fire tinder. Lacking metal nails, I relied on mortise and tenon joints. I carefully chiseled square tenons into the pillars and matching mortises into the beams, locking the frame tightly together with wooden wedges. The assembled structure was 12 feet long by 8 feet wide, completely solid and unshakable. For the roof, I tied wrist-thick rafters across the crossbeams up to the rock wall, securing them with vines. I covered the frame with layered ferns and wide sheets of tree bark, overlapping them like tiles to shed the rain. Next, I hauled clay from the riverbank, spread it across the muddy floor, and packed it down with a flat stone to create a hard, clean surface. In the southeast corner, I rebuilt my stone stove, using heat-tested stones mortared with wet clay. I angled the firebox toward the doorway for easy fueling and cut a palm-sized flue through the east wall, lining the opening with clay to prevent the wood from catching fire. Testing the stove with glowing embers, the smoke vented smoothly outside. Sitting inside the dry cabin under the bark roof, I felt protected from the damp mountain wind. Though the walls still needed wattle and daub to seal the drafts, my new home was finally taking shape. My new wooden cabin was a massive upgrade from the old makeshift shelter. With its mortise and tenon log frame, clay-sealed walls, elevated dry floor, and bark roof, the house kept out all drafts and rain. I moved all my possessions inside, hanging rows of smoked meat above the indoor hearth, storing leather armor along the rock wall, and placing my drying ash bough near the gentle warmth of the fire. By this time, my left shoulder had fully healed into a clean pink scab. I felt no pain when moving my arm, meaning the time had come to make the long journey south to the market town Blazer had mentioned. Living entirely on meat, fish, and foraged wild plants was not sustainable in the long run. If I wanted to take in refugees and expand my territory, I needed staple grains like rye, oats, or wheat, along with real salt and essential metal goods. I packed a heavy bundle of valuable trade goods, including skewers of smoked venison and boar jerky, bundles of cured hides, wild boar tusks, and stiff bristles. I secured the cabin by covering the door and fence gaps with thick vines and branches to keep out wild boars. Armed with my arming sword, short axe, and pickaxe, I set out down the riverbank and turned south across the mountainous ridges. After a day and a half of hiking across animal trails and sleeping under an old oak tree, the dense wilderness began to thin. By noon of the second day, I reached a wide packed dirt road marked by wagon ruts, horse hooves, and cleared fields of dark brown tilled earth. The remote wild was giving way to settled rural life. Continuing down the main road, I soon spotted a wooden palisade surrounding a lively settlement with smoke rising from stone chimneys. Outside the gates, traders and villagers sat under rough wooden stalls, surrounded by baskets and clay jars. Two guards, armed with spears, leaned against the entrance gate posts, watching intently as I approached with my heavy trade pack. At the market entrance, an armed guard in worn leather armor stepped forward with a polite smile, asking how he could assist me. I told him I was passing through and needed to trade for supplies. When he noticed my arming sword and asked if I was from the north, I slipped a silver penny into his palm. Pleased with the bribe, he directed me to the best merchants in the market. He advised me to trade furs on the west side, buy iron from the red-haired blacksmith on the south side, and purchase salt from the blacksmith's wife, who sold smuggled salt at a cheaper rate. Carrying my trade bundle inside, I took in the bustling market square. Rather than selling my durable roe deer and wild boar hides, I kept them for future personal use and focused on trading my smoked meats and collected materials. I headed straight to the blacksmith's stall on the south side. The blacksmith was busy forging tools on an anvil, while his plump sat nearby with clay jars and sacks of grain. I unwrapped my boar skin bundle and displayed the skewers of dark, firmly smoked roe deer and boar jerky. I traded several skewers of meat for 2 heavy earthenware jars of real salt, finally securing a proper alternative to crude wood ash salt. Next, I offered the stiff wild boar bristles to the red-haired blacksmith. He accepted them for brushmaking and traded me a rag full of forged iron nails in exchange. These nails would serve perfectly as sharp arrowheads for my drying ash bow, which was far more practical for me than raw, unworkable iron bars. Finally, I inspected the woman's grain sacks. Her rye and oats were dry, plump, and free of mold. Although her initial rate for grain was steep, I stacked the rest of my smoked jerky on the ground and negotiated to trade the entire pile for all 3 of her remaining sacks of rye. The heavy haul was too much to carry at once, so she agreed to hold the bags until I was ready to leave. Wrapping my remaining items, I walked over to another shed on the south side, where an elderly weaver displayed rolls of linen. Wearing my roe deer vest directly against sweaty skin had begun to stiffen the leather, making an inner cloth shirt essential. I knelt down and picked up a piece of fine linen, as the old man asked whether I wanted to trade or buy. I traded a curved wild boar tusk with the old weaver for 4 feet of fine linen to make a shirt lining, along with a piece of coarse linen for storage bags. Having finished my immediate trading, I headed south to the filthier, neglected outskirts of the market. There, abandoned wagons sheltered starving refugees who had lost everything during the northern Viking raids. I needed laborers to clear land, but bringing back a desperate adult carried too much risk of betrayal in my sleep. Instead, near an overturned wagon wheel, I noticed a gaunt, broad-shouldered boy of 14 or 15 scraping tree bark with a stone to eat. Beside him huddled a frail, sickly little girl. When I asked if he could farm, he told me he had worked in fields and at a baron's mill. I gave them 2 scraps of smoked jerky. The boy immediately fed the first piece to the girl before wolfing down the second. Seeing his loyalty and grit, I told them to come with me. I promised them warm broth and a roof, but firmly warned that any dishonesty would see him hung from an oak tree. The boy carried his sister and followed without hesitation. Returning to the blacksmith's stall, I finalized the grain trade with the fat woman, handing over the agreed-upon dried meat for 3 heavy sacks of rye. I tasked the boy with carrying 1 sack. Spotting a newly forged iron shovel by the anvil, I offered my last silver coin along with leftover leather scraps to buy it. The blacksmith agreed, handing over the tool. Heavily laden with my salt jars, nails, linen, iron shovel, and 2 full bags of rye across my shoulders, I led our small party north. Along the way, the boy told me his name was Oliver, and his sister was Lucy. Near the foot of the first mountain ridge, exhaustion caused Oliver to stumble and drop his sack. His face was scraped, and his knees shook violently. But he desperately tried to haul the grain back up. I walked over, lifted the heavy sack onto his shoulder, and watched him steady himself with clenched teeth. As I continued forward, his heavy, resolute footsteps followed close behind. To protect our valuable supplies of rye, salt, and tools from prying eyes, I led Oliver and Lucy off the main road and through the secluded woods. Traveling with 2 exhausted children slowed our pace, turning a 1-day trek into a 3-day journey. Throughout the arduous hike, Oliver carried his heavy sack of grain without a single complaint. When we finally arrived at the riverbank, the boy and his little sister stared in awe at my sturdy cabin and fenced compound. Leaning against the doorframe, I asked Oliver about his other skills. He proudly told me he knew how to patch roofs, weave straw mats, tie strong knots, and work field tools from sunrise to sunset. Seeing the practical calluses on his hands, I assigned him his duties. Starting the next day, he would help me clear 2 acres of hillside land by chopping trees, digging up roots, clearing stones, and planting rye. He would also help weave a dense thorn wall around the field to protect our future crops from hungry wild boars and birds. For Lucy, I tasked her with gathering firewood near the cabin to keep the hearth burning and foraging wild greens along the riverbank. That evening, I prepared a rich stew over the hearth fire. I cut chunks of fatty smoked boar and lean roe deer meat into an earthenware pot filled with water, seasoning it with a generous pinch of real salt. The warm aroma of meat and fat filled the entire room. I served myself the first portion of thick broth and meat in a carved wooden bowl, eating comfortably against the rock wall. Once I finished, I placed 2 large pieces of tender boar rib and venison onto bark platters and called the children forward. Oliver gave 1 portion to his sister before tearing into his own piece with desperate gratitude. Even though I possessed modern memories, I understood that maintaining strict hierarchy and authority was essential for survival in 9th century England. As the armed lord and protector of this domain, I took the best portions and driest bed. In return, I provided safety, warm food, and shelter against the harsh wilderness. After eating, I told the children to wash the dishes in the morning and sent them to sleep safely in a dry pile of hay by the warm stove. I told Oliver that his work here would be just as demanding as his days at the mill. We had to build defenses and clear wild land. But as long as he worked hard, I promised his sister would never starve. Hearing this, the boy held back tears and swore his complete loyalty in exchange for food. With 2 extra mouths to feed, my 3 sacks of rye would barely last until next year. Expanding our crop yield was an immediate necessity. At dawn, I found Oliver already awake at the stream, scrubbing my wooden bowl clean with river sand and freezing water. His natural diligence pleased me. In this harsh wilderness, only those who proved their worth deserved their share of smoked meat. I grabbed my iron shovel and headed to the riverbank. Before sowing the rye seeds and planting the cabbage seeds from Blackthorn Village, we had to secure the perimeter. Freshly tilled soil would quickly attract forest boars that could destroy an entire season of work overnight. I instructed Oliver to gather thorny brush, hooked wild rose branches, and deadwood from the forest edge. Meanwhile, I dug a trench half a foot deep around the 2-acre boundary line. Oliver hauled bundles of thorns into the trench, ignoring the bleeding scratches across his hands while I broke ground. We buried the thorny branches deep into the mud and stomped them down with our boots, creating a dense, waist-high barrier that no wild boar's snout could easily breach. We labored relentlessly from sunrise until dusk. By evening, a thick, spiked wall of earth and thorns encircled the entire field. Though exhausted from the digging, I decided to expand further before dark. I pointed Oliver toward the dense alder bushes on the south side to prepare a dedicated vegetable garden for the cabbage seeds, while Oliver braced his shoulder against a stubborn alder root to wrench it from the earth. I used a whetstone to sharpen my shovel blade in the mud, preparing to break more ground. Although the traditional spring planting window was slipping away, I knew that planting late was far better than having no crops at all. The common serfs only knew primitive methods, but I possessed advanced knowledge. By using drill sowing, balancing soil acidity with wood ash, fertilizing with river silt, and rotating crops, I could achieve a strong yield. Cabbage offered a rapid harvest within 2 months to stretch our food supplies, while the rye would serve as our long-term foundation. We began with the vegetable patch. Working from dawn to dusk, Oliver and I cleared brush, pulled roots, hauled stones, and turned the heavy clay. After days of back-breaking labor, we expanded the soft plot to half an acre and sowed all the cabbage seeds from Blackthorn Village. Each night, the 3 of us returned exhausted to the cabin. Lucy brought bundles of firewood she had gathered, while I rekindled the hearth fire to stew tender smoked meat seasoned with gray salt. Oliver was often so drained that he fell asleep with meat still in his mouth, curled beside his sister in the warm haystack. I ate my fill, placed my arming sword within arm's reach, and rested lightly while listening to the wind and the river. Next, we tackled the main 2-acre field for the rye. We dug out stubborn tree stumps, stacked the cleared field stones into piles along the border, and turned every inch of dark soil under the sun. When the soil was ready, I taught Oliver the method of drill sowing. Instead of scattering grain randomly across the ground, we dug neat, straight furrows guided by taut hemp cords. Oliver bent over to dig each ditch with the shovel, while I followed close behind, dropping rye seeds evenly into the bottom of the trench before burying and tamping them down with my boots. We repeated this process furrow by furrow until the entire 2-acre field was completed. Sowing the final handful of wheat, I looked over the evenly spaced, newly tilled land. We had done the hard work, and now we only needed to protect the sprouting seeds from hungry birds and pests. I rolled up the empty seed bag, gathered my shovel, and led the exhausted children back to the cabin. With Oliver tending the hearth fire and Lucy carefully sorting firewood, I enjoyed a rare moment of rest as master of our small settlement. Looking around the cabin, my eyes fell upon our single earthenware pot. It was our only container for boiling water and making soup, and breaking it would force us back to primitive cooking methods. With the rye field and cabbage patch expanding, I needed dozens of durable vessels to store grain, pickle vegetables, and haul fresh water before the rainy season arrived. Since buying pottery at the distant market was far too expensive, I resolved to make my own. I took my iron-shod shovel down to the meeting point of the river and mountain stream to gather the dark red clay I had spotted earlier. Testing the clay in my hands, I found it fine-textured, pliable, and relatively free sand. Back at the cabin, I cleaned a flat bluestone slab and picked out every stray pebble and root from the clay. I rolled the mud into a dense ball and slammed it repeatedly against the stone to vent all trapped air pockets, preventing the pottery from exploding during firing. Using the ancient coiling method, I rolled the clay into uniform, thumb-thick strips. I formed a solid disc for the base and layered the clay ropes upward to shape the walls of a deep jar. Lacking a potter's wheel, I carved a flat scraper from leftover ash wood to smooth the wet seams and blend the coils into a tight, solid shell. After shaping 2 deep-bellied jars and several wide clay bowls, Oliver asked if the dried mud would hold water. I explained that sun-drying was not enough, and that we needed a proper pit fire fueled with charcoal and pine wood to bake the mud until it turned rock-hard. I arranged the wet clay blanks along the rock wall, where the residual warmth from the hearth could dry them slowly without cracking. Feeling a deep sense of accomplishment, I told Oliver to serve the venison soup and get ready for sleep. I ordered him to gather 2 more sacks of red clay the next morning, so we could craft larger grain storage urns before the harvest. Early the next morning, Oliver returned from the stream with a linen sack full of dense, wet red clay. Leaving the heavy load beside my work slab, he took his tools and headed back down to continue work on the rye field. With the boy handling the rough farm labor and Lucy collecting firewood, I was able to dedicate my time to shaping essential household items. I prepared the fresh clay on a flat bluestone, using the spine of my arming sword to knead it while picking out tiny roots and pebbles. Storing the autumn rye harvest required much thicker and larger vessels than simple water jugs. If grain was left on the ground, dampness and forest rodents would ruin it within days. I needed large urns that could hold dozens of pounds of food, complete with tight clay lids. I formed large bases the size of millstones and built the walls up using arm-thick clay coils. Because the vessels were so heavy, each layer sagged under its own weight. I worked slowly, smoothing the wet seams with water and letting each tier dry slightly in the cabin's residual warmth before adding the next. By late afternoon, I had 3 half-human-sized grain urns drying at the base of the rock wall. The smaller water jars and bowls made previously had already dried to a light gray, though they still needed several more days before being fired. The following morning, I paused our pottery work to sow our cabbage seeds while the soil remained damp. Oliver and I walked down to the half-acre vegetable garden beside the rye field, which was now fully protected by a dense, waist-high thorn wall. Instead of scattering the seeds randomly like typical peasants, I showed Oliver how to plant with precision. I drew straight, shallow furrows in the earth with my finger, dropped 1 or 2 seeds every half-palm width, and covered them with a thin layer of fine soil. Although the spacing method seemed slow and unfamiliar to Oliver, he copied my movements carefully, keeping the seeds at an even depth across the plot. By noon, the entire vegetable patch was neatly sown. As we admired the orderly field, Oliver asked if the tiny seeds would truly become the large leaves sold in town markets. I assured him that with proper protection from wild boars, these plants would feed us through the winter. Having reliable help freed me from daily chores, allowing my broader plans for the settlement to truly take root. As our initial clay blanks finished drying in the cabin shade, I turned my attention to the fuel supply. Raw pine wood burned too quickly and unevenly, which would easily crack the pottery during firing. High temperatures and steady heat were essential, making quality charcoal our only reliable option. I had Oliver gather the dried oak and birch logs we had cut down during our land clearing. Downwind from the cabin, we dug a shallow round pit and stacked the stripped hardwood into a dense, solid cone. I wove hazelwood branches around the woodpile to form a sturdy cage, then plastered the exterior with a thick layer of wet mud and dry hay for insulation. I left a vent hole at the top and 4 small intake holes at the base, facing the 4 cardinal directions. I lit the top of the kiln with hot embers and pine needles, allowing the fire to slowly spread downward. Thick white smoke rose into the air, filling the clearing with the pungent smell of wood tar. I instructed Oliver on how to manage the kiln, showing him how to watch the smoke color, poke the lower vents if the flow stopped, and smother any escaping flames with wet mud. In this era, charcoal burning was a guarded trade secret held only by manor craftsmen, and Oliver watched the process with intense focus and admiration. While Oliver tended the charcoal mound, I dug a circular pit nearly 1 meter deep to serve as our pottery kiln. The underground pit acted like a natural funnel to concentrate heat. I lined the earthen walls with smooth red clay and laid down birch bark for the initial firing. Soon, Oliver alerted me that the smoke from the lower vents had turned thin and blue, signaling that the wood oils had burned off. We waited a short while longer before sealing all 4 intake holes with mud to let the charcoal finish smoldering in the airtight mound. By nightfall, the 5 sun-dried clay vessels were brittle, pale, and ready for firing. I checked the sealed charcoal mound one last time to ensure no sparks remained, then led Oliver back to the cabin. I promised him that if our charcoal turned out well the next morning, we would finally fire our pottery and fill our new water jugs by the end of the day. The next morning, Oliver and I opened the cooled charcoal mound. Prying away the hardened clay shell revealed piles of gleaming, high-quality black charcoal that rang like clashing metal when tapped together. We packed 3 full linen sacks of fuel, yielding roughly 25 kilograms of charcoal to power our upcoming firings. Next, I completed our underground kiln pit. In the center, I dug a lower basin to collect falling ash and built a raised circular ring of clay above it. I then tunneled a slanted ventilation channel from the outside directly into the lower basin, creating natural draft pressure to pull in fresh air. Across the raised platform, I laid flat river pebbles with open gaps to form a kiln bed and lined the pit walls with an insulating mix of red clay and wood ash. After lighting a small fire to dry and harden the earthen lining, the kiln was ready. I carefully placed our 5 air-dried clay pieces onto the pebble bed, with space between them for heat circulation. I arranged 8 kilograms of charcoal around the vessels, topped the mound with dry leaves and birch bark, and dropped an ember down the draft tunnel to ignite the base. As the draft pulled the flames upward, I covered the pit with flat stone slabs, leaving small center vents, and sealed every seam with wet mud to trap the intense heat inside. Oliver and I took turns keeping watch for a full day and night, patching emerging cracks with fresh mud. By the following morning, the smoke had completely stopped. Prying open the hot stone covers and clearing the grayish-white ash, we retrieved our finished pottery. The first piece, a sturdy clay bowl, emerged intact and rang clear when tapped, while one water jug and a bowl had cracked from residual moisture during the firing. The second water jug and another bowl survived fully hardened and functional. A 60% success rate on our very first primitive test was a massive victory. I comforted a disappointed Oliver, explaining that the broken shards would serve as heat spacers for our next firing, while the leftover ash would enrich our rye fields. Carrying our new water jar and bowls back to the cabin, I prepared to let our 3 large grain urns dry several days longer before firing them. Looking at the 3 half-person high clay urns, air-drying in the cabin, I knew the real challenge was just beginning. These thick vessels were designed to protect our upcoming rye harvest from moisture and rodents. However, with walls 3 fingers thick, firing them required immense, sustained heat to prevent them from shattering into slag. Our remaining charcoal was not enough, so I ordered Oliver to chop down more oak trees while we prepared for a much longer firing process. Meanwhile, flocks of hungry jackdaws gathered around our newly sown fields to dig up the exposed seeds. Rather than wasting my precious iron-tipped arrows on birds, I carved a pair of wooden clappers from ash wood scraps and tied them with vines. I gave the noisemaker to Lucy and tasked her with patrolling the field ridges. Whenever the birds landed, she shook the clappers vigorously, sending the pests flying away and keeping the seeds safe. Over the next 3 days, we completed a second batch of charcoal, bringing our total supply to roughly 42 kilograms. Before adding the high-energy charcoal, I had Oliver burn bundles of dry branches inside the kiln pit. This pre-warmed the earthen walls and gently drew the last traces of deep moisture from the clay urns. Once the air from the vent turned dry and hot, we used hazelwood levers to carefully lower the heavy urns into the pit in a triangular layout. I climbed down and packed every crevice between and around the vessels with black charcoal. I ignited the base through the intake duct, covered the pit with heavy bluestone slabs, and sealed the edges with wet mud. For an entire night, Oliver and I tended the kiln, adjusting the vents every half hour to maintain even airflow. When the underground roar faded by morning, I sealed the openings completely and let the kiln cool untouched for 2 full days. On the 3rd morning, we pried open the bluestone slabs and cleared away the thick white ash. The first 2 grain urns had fired into dark gray, rock-hard vessels that rang with a clear metallic tone when tapped with my sword hilt. The 3rd urn, positioned closest to the draft vent, had cracked down its belly from the sudden heat surge, but it remained useful for storing dry firewood or charcoal. Producing 2 massive, airtight grain urns in the raw wilderness was a tremendous victory that secured our future harvest. Early the next morning, I walked out to the fields and found tender pale blue shoots breaking through the soil in our rye plot. The seeds had successfully sprouted. To nourish the crop and protect the seedlings from late spring frost, I gathered the wood ash and charcoal residue left in our pottery kiln. Oliver carried an old linen sack lined with broad leaves, and I scattered the nutrient-rich ash evenly between the furrows to neutralize the acidic forest soil. Next, I stepped over to our half-acre vegetable garden. Near the water's edge, I spotted tiny, heart-shaped green leaves unfurling in the moist earth. Our cabbage seeds had also taken root. I cautioned Oliver to be extremely careful, while weeding so he would not mistake the delicate sprouts for grass. When he asked if we should start watering them from the stream, I explained that the ground was already moist enough, and that excess water would only rot their tender roots. In about 3 months, these cabbages would yield fresh greens to enrich our daily meat stews. With 3 mouths to feed, our smoked meat was dwindling faster than anticipated, and 2 acres of rye would not be enough if a famine struck. To establish a proper 3-field crop rotation system, I decided to clear at least 1 more acre of wasteland to the south near the alder bushes. I intended to trade for beans or oats on my next market trip to plant in this new plot. I sent Oliver to fetch his pickaxe, and we immediately began breaking ground on the new fallow field. The tangled grass roots and stubborn alder stumps were deeply embedded in the clay, requiring heavy, exhausting labor to pry loose. Oliver wondered why we were preparing the field without having seeds in hand yet. I told him that the soil must always be ready and waiting for the seeds, not the other way around. Even if we had to wait for seeds, having the land cleared and fenced would allow it to rest and gather strength for next year's harvest. We worked relentlessly beneath the sun, turning wild dirt into an organized square of productive farmland. Looking at our dwindling smoked meat hanging from the cabin beams, I grew anxious. With Oliver and Lucy working hard and eating regularly, our food supplies were disappearing far faster than expected. The crops in the fields were months away from harvest, making fresh meat from the forest an urgent necessity to preserve our remaining winter rations. Leaving my clanking chainmail behind to move silently, I took my ash wood bow and 3 heavy iron-tipped arrows into the broadleaf forest. I tracked game deep into the woods, finding a gentle slope covered in sorrel, alfalfa, and fresh animal droppings. I concealed myself in a thicket of hazelwood and waited patiently. After some time, a plump wild hare emerged from a tree root 30 meters away. I drew the heavy bowstring, held my breath, and fired. The arrow pierced the hare's neck, pinning it to the ground. After checking the area for prowling predators, I retrieved my arrow, grabbed the 4-pound rabbit, and headed back to camp. Back at the cabin, I skinned the hare with my sword, tossed the fresh meat into a boiling pot with a pinch of salt, and served the rich broth to the children. As I handed Lucy her bowl, I noticed that her hands, along with Oliver's, were severely chapped, swollen, and cut from working in the icy mountain streams and muddy fields. 1 small rabbit skin was not enough. I needed more pelts to craft protective hand wraps and ankle coverings to keep them from becoming crippled by frostbite. However, inspecting my ash bough by the fire revealed serious trouble. The rushed, unseasoned wood had developed stress fractures along its belly. The composite string was fraying, and the heavy arrow had slightly bent on impact. Risking my only ranged weapon and costly iron-tipped arrows on small game was far too dangerous with Viking raiders potentially nearby. I decided to retire the damaged bow for true emergencies, greasing it with deer fat and storing it safely in a dry rock crevice. To hunt rabbits efficiently without wasting arrows, I instructed Oliver to cut flexible willow branches and gather vines the following day. We would construct passive snare traps on the grassy slopes to secure a steady supply of meat and fur while continuing our land clearing. Early in the morning, Oliver brought 2 bundles of flexible willow branches from the stream. I tested their resilience and decided to use them alongside leftover fence vines to craft passive snare traps. This method would let us capture game continuously without exhausting ourselves with heavy labor or risking our fragile weapons. I stripped the inner fibers from the soaked vines and twisted them into sturdy finger-thick ropes capable of holding tens of pounds. I tied a clean slip knot at the end of each cord to create an adjustable noose. Next, I split pine scraps into sharp stakes, carving a horizontal groove near the top of each one. I then whittled flat hazelwood pegs to act as sensitive triggers that would fit snugly into the notches. Oliver and I carried the trap components to the grassy slope where hares frequently fed. Finding a well-worn animal path, I selected a flexible birch sapling by the trail. Oliver pulled the sapling down until its tip bent near the ground, where I tied the vine rope and attached the trigger peg. I drove the grooved stake into the earth, carefully set the trigger mechanism under tension, and suspended the noose half a fist above the run. I placed small twigs around the snare to funnel passing hares directly into the loop. In total, we set 4 concealed snares along the slope. Back at the cabin, I greased my damaged ash bough with deer fat and stored it safely in a high rock crevice, saving it strictly for true emergencies. Seeing Oliver and Lucy's severely chapped, bleeding hands by the fire, I knew their injuries could hinder our farm work. I mixed rendered deer fat with fine wood ash to create a soothing, antibacterial ointment. Although Oliver felt guilty about using precious fat on his skin, I insisted on treating both of them. I rubbed the thick salve deep into Lucy's swollen knuckles and Oliver's cracked calluses, enduring their initial winces of pain to ensure the oil sealed their wounds against the biting night chill. I ordered them to keep their hands warm and dry in the hay, promising to sew protective rabbit skin mittens once our new traps yielded enough pelts. At dawn, I headed into the woods with only my hand axe to check the snares on the grassy slope. Reaching the clearing, I saw that the first trap had sprung, but the loop hung empty. The overturned leaves showed that a hare had walked into the snare and escaped. Rubbing the cord between my fingers, I realized our lingering scent of human sweat and deer fat had alerted the animal at the last second. In addition, with fresh spring shoots growing everywhere, the rabbits had little reason to follow an old trail. To fix this, I rubbed my hands and the components with damp black mud to mask the scent. I reset the trigger mechanism and scattered freshly picked sorrel leaves and crushed berries along the path as bait. The other traps had also yielded nothing, so I instructed Oliver to look for sweet berries and tender alfalfa tips while we worked. Throughout the afternoon, Oliver and I continued clearing the southern field, turning another half-acre of wasteland into neat brown furrows. Over the next 2 days, I checked the snares each morning. Though they remained empty at first, I stayed patient, continuing to coat the ropes with mud, while Lucy scattered fresh alfalfa around the triggers. On the 4th morning, my persistence was rewarded. 2 birch saplings had snapped upright, and 2 large adult hares hung suspended by the neck. The snares had killed them instantly, without damaging their pelts, leaving the fur in pristine condition. I carried the game back to the cabin, where the sight of fresh meat brought pure joy to Oliver and Lucy. I ordered Oliver to wash the pot for tonight's stew, then used my arming sword to skin the hares cleanly from the fat layer. Combined with my previous catch, I now had 3 high-grade rabbit pelts, propped against the stone wall to dry. I called Oliver over to measure his hands. Rather than crafting complex 5-finger gloves, I decided to make durable mittens. I planned to use tough deerskin scraps for the outer shell to withstand heavy labor, line the inside with soft rabbit fur for warmth, and secure them at the wrists with deer sinew. By the warm firelight, I picked up my bone awl and began piercing the leather, ready to protect the hands essential to our settlement's survival. Simply air-drying raw hides was not enough to make practical gear, as untreated pelts would turn brittle and snap when bent. Over the next several days, I led a grueling tanning process to turn our 3 fresh rabbit skins into protective work gloves. First, I laid the pelts flat on a stone slab and carefully used the back of my hand axe to scrape away residual meat and tissue without tearing the thin hide. Then, Oliver, Lucy, and I took turns rubbing rendered deer fat deep into the leather. We repeatedly worked and stretched the skins over a smooth pine log to break the stiff fibers. After days of continuous kneading by the fire, the hard skins transformed into soft, pliable felt. Next, I prepared the materials for sewing. Using charcoal, I traced Oliver and Lucy's hands onto a wooden board to create a simple mitten pattern with separate thumbs. I cut the tough outer shells from leftover deerskin scraps to resist heavy wear from tool handles. For the inner linings, I cut the softened rabbit pelts with the fluffy fur facing inward. Stitching the layers together was hard, exhausting work. Using a sharp deer bone awl, I punched holes through the double-layered leather every half centimeter. I threaded oiled linen cord through the holes, pulling each stitch tight to bind the deerskin and rabbit fur securely. By nightfall, I completed 2 thick pairs of mittens. Oliver slipped his hands inside, feeling immediate relief as the soft fur shielded his painful chilblains from the cold. I gave the smaller pair to Lucy, telling her she could wear them to sleep so her cracked skin would finally heal. The next morning, Oliver wore his new dark brown gloves to clear rocks and swing the pickaxe. Protected from the sharp stone edges and freezing wind, his work efficiency increased significantly without the fear of reopening his hand wounds. Later that day, I retrieved another 3-pound hare from the snares. Fresh rabbit meat stewed with wild garlic had become our steady food source, saving the precious smoked venison on our cabin beams. By turning simple forest game into nourishing meals and warm gear, I successfully preserved our food reserves and empowered my young workers to keep clearing our growing territory. Over the past few months, our snares provided a steady supply of fresh hairs and valuable pelts. During the height of summer, I traded a large bundle of tanned skins at the market for southern white salt, broad beans, and oat seeds. Back at our base, I planted the fast-growing broad beans near the stream and the oats across the remaining hillside slope. By late June, our cabbage patch began supplying fresh greens for our stews, curing the children of malnutrition. On day 145, the harvest arrived. The 2 acres of rye bent heavy with grain, and the cabbage patch was packed with broad, healthy leaves. I ordered Oliver to dig up the cabbage while I used my sickle to cut down the golden stalks of wheat. We worked tirelessly under the warm sun, binding the wheat into heavy sheaves with vines. Next, we laid out a large linen sheet on the packed ground and threshed the rye by beating the ears with wooden sticks. Plump, dark brown grains rained onto the cloth. Oliver stared in complete shock at the growing pile of grain. On the northern manors where he grew up, tenant farmers surrendered almost everything to their lords, leaving barely enough to survive. From our 2 acres alone, we harvested an astonishing 210 kilograms of rye. I told Oliver that following proper methods and respecting the land would always yield rewards. We poured the cleaned rye into our large ceramic urn, topping it with an inch of dry wood ash and sealing the stone lid with red clay. We chopped and salted the remaining cabbages, packing them tightly into the second urn as our winter vegetable reserve. Calculating our provisions, I knew the grain alone would last about 4 months after setting aside 20 kilograms for next year's seeds. However, combining the rye porridge with salted cabbage, our remaining smoked venison, and regular snare catches meant we had more than enough food to survive comfortably until the spring planting in March. Furthermore, our pending harvest of broad beans and oats would add even more security. Unlike the oppressed serfs on noble estates who lost their yields to heavy taxes and tithes, every grain we harvested belonged entirely to us. By the fire that evening, Oliver asked with awe if we would truly be free from hunger this winter. I assured him we would, as long as we guarded our home. Gripping the hilt of my sword, I prepared to defend our hard-earned harvest against the hungry beasts and desperate bandits of the coming winter. Our newly harvested rye was hard and difficult to digest when cooked whole in broth. Without grinding the grain into flour, we suffered from severe bloating, and our bodies could not absorb the calories efficiently. Buying a millstone at the market was out of the question, because they were far too heavy and expensive. My only realistic choice was to handcraft a rotary stone mill, using rocks found on the mountain. Oliver and I climbed the steep rocky ridge behind the cabin to search for suitable stone. I bypassed the crumbly sandstone in favor of dense, hard granite that possessed natural crystalline roughness. I located 2 flat, glacial-weathered granite stones, about 40 centimeters in diameter, perfectly sized for an upper and lower millstone. Together, the heavy pair weighed over 100 pounds. Prying them from the ground took immense effort, and we laboriously hauled them back to camp on an old linen sheet. Back at the cabin, I marked a fist-sized circle in the center of the thicker stone using a piece of charcoal. This opening would serve as the hopper for the grain. Without drills or precision tools, I relied on my market-bought iron nails and the back of my hand axe to chisel into the rock. The work was grueling and quickly blunted our tools. As I pounded the nails into the hard granite, stone dust flew in all directions. Oliver stood by with a pot of cold water to cool the heated nail tips and rinse away the debris, while I repeatedly sharpened the worn metal on a flat piece of sandstone. By dusk, I had successfully chiseled through the center hole of the upper millstone. Next, I carved a shallow hole into the center of the lower stone to house the central wooden spindle. I whittled a peg from dense oak and hammered it securely into the base. When I mounted the upper stone onto the spindle and rotated it, the rough faces ground together with a harsh screech. To turn whole rye into fine flour, rather than merely flattening the grains, the surfaces needed groove teeth. Using a thinner nail, I began the meticulous task of chiseling diagonal, scale-like channels across the contact faces. Working under the cool evening breeze, I raised my axe once more to complete our grain mill. I finished carving the grinding teeth by chiseling radiating diagonal lines outward from the center hole. These angled grooves would push the rye grains from the center to the edges while crushing them into powder. By nightfall, our heavy granite mill stood complete in the clearing outside the cabin, fitted with a sturdy ash wood turning handle. The next morning, we tested our new creation. I had Lucy place a clean linen sheet beneath the millstones to catch the flour. Oliver gripped the wooden handle with his gloved hands and began pushing the heavy upper stone in circles. As the dry grinding sound began, I poured a steady stream of whole rye into the center eye. The harsh noise instantly softened into a steady, rhythmic rumble as the stone teeth crushed the hard husks. Soon, warm, light brown flour mixed with bran began spilling along the channels onto the linen cloth. It was coarser and darker than refined flour, but it had a rich, wholesome grain aroma. In this feudal era, owning a millstone was a privilege strictly reserved for the nobility and the church, where peasants were forced to surrender a heavy tax on every batch of grain they ground. Seeing our own independent supply of flour pile up gave the children profound hope. That evening, I prepared our first batch of fresh rye flatbreads. I poured stream water into a bowl of the unsifted flour, kneading the sticky dough into soft purplish-brown rounds. On the stone stove, I melted a piece of fatty smoked deer meat until it sizzled across a hot, smooth flagstone. I pressed the flattened dough onto the greased stone, filling the cabin with an incredible aroma of toasted grain and savory animal fat. I sandwiched spoonfuls of our salted pickled cabbage between the golden, crispy flatbreads and handed the steaming portions to Lucy and Oliver. The bread was dense, chewy, and deeply satisfying. Eating the warm flatbread alongside the salty cabbage soothed our stomachs after months of surviving solely on meat and greens. Sitting by the warm stove with our own flour and winter stores, we had finally established complete food security. We were fully prepared to face the bitter winter ahead, without fear of famine. Early in the morning, I walked up the mountain stream to check my rabbit snares. When I reached the third trap beneath a birch sapling, my hand instinctively tightened on the hilt of my sword. The trap had been triggered, but the loop was empty. On the trampled grass lay bits of gray rabbit fur, alongside fresh, flat boot prints, made of rough burlap and leather. There were at least 2 intruders, and nearby lay the remains of a small, expertly buried fire. Looking down from the ridge, our cabin and harvested fields stood out as tempting targets for starving men. Following the tracks into the woods, I discovered dark red blood smeared at shoulder height on an old oak tree. Wounded, desperate outlaws who had stolen our rabbit would likely return for our full grain urns. I returned to the outpost immediately and ordered Oliver and Lucy inside the cabin, telling the boy to ready our iron-tipped arrows. We canceled farm work to fortify our defenses. Sight could easily fail in the dark, but sound would give us an early warning. I retrieved brittle pottery shards from our first firing, along with gnawed deer bones. I strung thin, dry vine cores across the 3 main approaches to the cabin, hanging the shards and bones within the bushes. Anyone tripping the concealed cords in the leaves would trigger loud, clattering chimes. I also instructed Lucy to loosely scatter dry oak twigs around the base of the fence so that approaching footsteps would snap and crack. Next, I addressed the vulnerable sections of our perimeter fence. I dug 4 narrow pits inside the boundary, each deep enough to swallow an ankle. I carved hardwood stakes, hardened the sharp tips over the stove fire, and planted them upright at the bottom of the pits. I covered the traps with thin straw and loose dirt to break the ankles or pierce the boots of anyone trying to climb over. Finally, I secured the cabin entrance. I used one of my last precious iron nails and a grooved slab of pine wood to fashion a sturdy rotating door bolt inside the frame. I instructed Oliver on how to lock the entrance with a heavy stone slab each night. With our perimeter trapped and alarm lines set, we braced for our uninvited guests. A few hundred meters from our cabin, 3 starving, routed soldiers from Northumbria plotted to attack us. Having fled the Viking onslaught, their leader and his men noticed our fresh wheat stubble and smelled our smoked meat. Believing I was just a solitary knight burdened by 2 helpless children, they planned to sneak in under the cover of night, kill me in my sleep with clubs, and steal all our winter provisions. Using the rushing noise of the stream to mask their footsteps, they approached our compound. Inside the cabin, I did not sleep. Wearing my heavy chainmail, I sat against the rock wall with my sword across my knees, keeping my ear pressed to the ventilation slit in the earthen wall. Having seen the intruder tracks earlier, I refused to leave our survival to chance. In the dead of night, the three men crept along the stream. Seeking an easy entrance, they targeted what appeared to be a weak gap in our fence, unaware that I had deliberately left it as a bait zone. The last vagrant in line stepped boldly onto a patch of flat, soft earth. The thin covering gave way beneath him. With a sharp crack, his foot plunged into the hidden pit, driving the fire-hardened hardwood stake straight through his thin shoe and deep into his soul-shattering bone. A blood-curdling scream tore through the valley, and his thrashing body instantly pulled our concealed tripwire. In the hazelwood bushes, the suspended pottery shards and deer bones began clattering loudly. I immediately woke Oliver in a low, authoritative voice. I ordered him to bar the entrance shut with a heavy stone slab and protect his sister. Grabbing my strung ash longbow and 3 heavy iron-tipped arrows, I moved silently to the wall slit. Through the gap, I saw one intruder writhing on the ground in agony, clutching his ruined foot, while the other 2 crouched back to back, in sheer panic with their crude weapons raised. As the wounded man's frantic cries turned to weak whimpers in the cold mud, I felt no pity. Any desperate predator attempting to steal our life-saving food in the dead of night deserved no mercy. Cold and focused, I slowly drew back the bowstring. Ignoring the wounded man groaning in the pit trap, I fixed my gaze through the wall slit on the 2 remaining figures by the fence. They were huddled in panic, blindly waving wooden clubs in the dark. I drew my ash longbow to full tension and released the heavy, iron-nailed arrow. The shot streaked 20 meters through the mist and struck the left intruder square in the chest, dropping him lifeless into the thorn bushes. I moved immediately. Grabbing my arming sword, I removed the heavy stone bolt from the door and ordered Oliver to charge out with his iron-shod shovel. Oliver overcame his fear and followed closely behind me. Seeing a fully armored knight emerge alongside a dead comrade and a trapped ally, the outlaw's leader panicked. He abandoned his men, scrambled over the fence, and fled into the dark woods. I pursued him at full sprint through the soft rye field, shouting for Oliver to circle around and cut off his escape. If this survivor reached the market or vagrant camps, hordes of starving refugees would descend upon our cabin. Even worse, if word reached the local baron's foresters, a feudal garrison could arrive to hang us for cultivating the Lord's woodland without permission. Fueled by weeks of nourishing meat and training, I closed the distance quickly, despite the weight of my heavy chainmail. The malnourished leader realized he could not outrun an armored warrior. In desperate terror, he turned and lunged at me with a chipped dagger. I easily sidestepped his clumsy attack and parried with my arming sword, the impact shattering his grip and sending him sprawling into the mud. Before he could recover, Oliver struck from the flank, swinging his iron-shod wooden shovel into the leader's ankle with a sickening crack. The heavy blow knocked the man flat. Pinning his dagger arm to the ground with my boot, I thrust my sword straight through his chest, ending his life instantly. I pulled out my blade and wiped the blood onto the dead man's clothes. After praising Oliver for his quick actions, I led him back to the fields to deal with the wounded intruder trapped in the pit and interrogate him about where their band had come from. I led Oliver back toward the trap, where the wounded intruder was trying to crawl away through the wheat stubble. Stepping forward, I slammed my arming sword into the frozen ground right before his face. Terrified and covered in cold sweat, the man collapsed into the mud, begging for his life and offering to become my slave. Ignoring his pleas of starvation, I demanded to know who they were and what was happening in the north. The man introduced himself as Bart, an escaped tenant farmer from Lord Tarn's burned manor. He confirmed that only the 3 of them remained after their companion died of hunger. More importantly, he revealed that York had fallen to the Viking great heathen army. Both Northumbrian kings were dead, and long ships were sailing south toward the Mercian border. Hearing this, I realized the historical timeline. It was late autumn of 867 AD. The northern defenses had collapsed, and the Viking invasion would soon spill into our woodlands. Time was running out faster than I had anticipated. Looking down at Bart, I saw his pierced foot was already turning bluish-purple and swelling with dirt and infection. In this harsh wilderness without clean water or medicine, his wound meant an agonizing death. In our resource-scarce territory, I could not waste food and salt on a crippled captive, nor could I leave him wailing in the fields to attract predators. I had Oliver step back, grip my sword hilt, and thrust the blade through Bart's chest, ending his misery. I ordered a shaken Oliver to fetch the ash sack. Before dawn broke, we dragged all 3 corpses to a distant rocky ravine to the south and buried them under rubble and soil. Back at the trampled rye field, I scattered thick layers of cold wood ash over the bloodstains to mask the scent and prevent wild beasts from tracking us. Exhausted, I leaned against the cabin wall. The fall of York meant the Viking storm would soon flood into the heart of Mercia along the river tributaries. I had to brace our outpost for the chaos and conflict ahead. The fall of York and the collapse of Northumbria meant a massive wave of refugees was flooding south toward Mercia. The 3 intruders we dealt with were just the beginning. As winter approached, my harvested rye and rising cabin smoke would become dangerous beacons for starving vagrants. A few simple pit traps and iron-tipped arrows could not hold off a mob of desperate men forever. To protect what I had built, I needed to expand my manpower and secure loyal laborers before heavy snow sealed the mountain passes. I had the grain and meat to feed 2 more working adults. In exchange, their labor could help build thick earthen walls and deep defensive trenches around the settlement. However, I refused to recruit from the distant market. The drifters there had grown deceitful and opportunistic from living in squalor. Bringing a cunning man into my small cabin was an unnecessary risk that could destroy us from within. Instead, I looked for fresh serfs fleeing burned northern villages who still held the honest, hard-working nature of farmers. Ideally, I wanted men with families. Single drifters had no attachments and were prone to betrayal, while a family man with a wife and children had natural vulnerabilities. Offering food to save their children and a warm roof over their heads would earn their absolute, unshakable loyalty. I expanded our scouting area several miles south into the dense forest, where refugees would naturally travel to avoid highway bandits and Baron Bolton's requisition patrols. For nearly 2 weeks, Oliver and I spent our days quietly lying in wait along hidden trails and creek banks. Oliver grew impatient after 3 quiet days, but I ordered him to stay silent and observe. In this vast forest, movement was slow and cautious. Soon my patience paid off. On a sheltered slope downstream, I discovered flattened grass from a recent camp. And 2 days later, I found coarse, cheap linen fibers snagged on an ash tree branch. The broken weave was typical peasant clothing, proving that serfs were indeed moving through the area. I did not rush to track the travelers immediately. Instead, I carefully erased our own footprints and established concealed observation blinds along key mountain passes. Like a patient fisherman, I waited for exhausted, vulnerable family groups who would accept my protection and surrender their loyalty for a chance to survive the winter. Deep in the woods, an escaped northern tenant family was struggling to survive. The husband had spent hours digging frozen mud to scavenge a few withered hawthorns and moldy hazelnuts left behind by squirrels, handing the meager scrap to his wife and their starving 4-year-old child. He tried to comfort them with hopes of finding refuge on a Mercian manor. Yet the woman knew the brutal reality during wartime famine. Noble lords only wanted able-bodied men to swing hoes and pitchforks. A frail mother and a helpless child were viewed as costly burdens rather than useful assets. Furthermore, under royal law, simply foraging wild nuts and fallen deadwood in the lord's forest was considered illegal theft punishable by hanging. While patrolling upwind along the stream with Oliver, I caught unnatural movement in the brush ahead. Wearing my chainmail and carrying my arming sword and round shield, I called out into the valley to demand who was hiding in the shadows. Seeing an armored warrior, the refugee husband panicked. To serfs, chainmail and fine steel belonged exclusively to ruthless noblemen or lordly patrols. Believing they were caught by bounty hunters or the baron's foresters, the man shoved his wife and child backward to let them flee. In desperate terror, he drew a small, rusted machete and charged straight at me to buy his family time. His movements were wild, weak, and unsteady from severe hunger. I did not even bother drawing my sword. As he lunged forward, I stepped into his path and drove my heavy round shield firmly into his shoulder. The solid impact sent the emaciated man flying through the air before he crashed into a muddy puddle, his weapon knocked away into a rock crevice. Up the slope, the exhausted woman tried to scramble into the thickets with her child, but she tripped over loose stones and collapsed in terror. Oliver quickly moved to cut off her escape path, brandishing his fire-hardened wooden spear. With the father incapacitated in the mud and the mother trapped on the hillside, the terrified family was completely at our mercy. The man lay trembling in the cold mud, frantically begging for his life. He wept and pleaded that he had only gathered a few wild hazelnuts and berries to keep his starving child alive, swearing he never meant to trespass on my land. Seeing my armor and weapon, he treated me with the absolute terror due to a noble lord. Keeping my hand on my sword, I maintained my commanding posture. I told him that every tree and plant in this woodland belonged to me, and that trespassing was a crime punishable by hanging. His wife collapsed in tears on the slope, clutching their child in despair. Seeing their deep fear and the man's work-hardened hands, I offered him an alternative. I stated that I was developing this territory and required hard-working, obedient tenant farmers. The man introduced himself as Thomas. I pardoned his offense and promised to provide his family with food and shelter if they swore absolute allegiance and worked my land. Overcome with relief and gratitude, Thomas bowed deeply to the earth before gathering his family to follow us. Oliver retrieved Thomas's dropped, rusted machete to melt down for scrap iron, keeping his spear pointed at the family from a safe distance as we marched back. When we arrived at the outpost, Thomas stopped in his tracks, staring in complete awe at our fortified cabin, the sprouted fields, and the large grain urns. In this deep wilderness, seeing such orderly farmland and solid buildings was astonishing. I did not let them into the cabin immediately. To test his claims and endurance, I handed Thomas a sickle and ordered him to repair the section of thorn fence trampled during the previous night's raid. Instead of piling branches haphazardly, Thomas constructed sturdy wooden tripods and wove thorny vines through them, sealing the gaps with red clay. His seasoned craftsmanship was evident. Satisfied with his initial work, I directed him to the newly cleared southern plot to dig out deep tree roots with a pickaxe. Despite his exhaustion and hunger, Thomas swung the tool with remarkable precision, slicing through stubborn roots far more efficiently than Oliver or I ever could. While Thomas worked in the field, his wife, Mary, helped Lucy sort and dry damp firewood by the hearth. Within half an hour, Thomas dug 2 large pits in the new plot, proving his tremendous value as a skilled laborer. Even with 3 more mouths to feed, having an experienced serf meant our settlement's expansion rate would more than double. I called them over to share our food. Standing before them in my chainmail with my hand on my sword hilt, I established my authority. I declared that my name was Adrian, the rightful lord of this woodland, and a knight appointed by the king. In this chaotic age of Viking raids, asserting a noble title provided the structure and certainty they desperately sought. I also introduced Oliver as my appointed squire, announcing that his orders carried my full authority. Overcome with relief and gratitude to be under a knight's protection, Thomas led his family to kneel and press their foreheads to the muddy ground. I stirred the rich rye porridge, which was thick with rabbit fat, and served a large bowl for myself before giving them their shares. I laid down 2 unbreakable rules for my territory: no stealing under any circumstance, and absolute obedience to my commands. If they obeyed, they would always have food from my pot. The starving family devoured every drop of porridge and licked the bowls completely clean. After they finished eating, I reinforced the hierarchy necessary to maintain order. My well-built wooden cabin was the seat of my authority, and serfs could not sleep in the knight's quarters. I led them outside to a sheltered clearing 10 paces west, nestled against the rock wall where the cabin's side window could easily keep watch over them. I granted Thomas permission to use our threshing leftover straw. Thrilled by this blessing, Thomas and Mary dragged dead logs against the stone cliff and wove thick straw mats over the frame. Within hours, they constructed a sturdy, windproof thatched shelter. Oliver assisted by cutting securing vines, fully embracing his new role as my watchful squire. As night fell, I returned to the warmth of my cabin. Seeing the thatched hut standing beside the rock wall, I knew my outpost had gained its first official subjects, marking the true beginning of my feudal settlement. At dawn, Thomas and his family were already waiting outside my cabin, shivering in the autumn frost. Seeing me emerge in my chainmail, they bowed with deep humility. I immediately assigned them their daily tasks before the ground froze for winter. I ordered Thomas to take the iron-shod shovel and clear the southern boundary marked by Oliver, while Mary was tasked with weaving large storage baskets from vines and tending the cabbage patch with Lucy. Having a skilled, obedient serf take over the heavy labor freed me from exhausting chores. Thomas worked tirelessly on the plots from sunrise to sunset, while Mary managed the camp. With the outpost secure in their hands, I carried my ash longbow and led Oliver deeper into the southern woods to search for more refugee families. Thomas's arrival had proven that serfs with families were the ideal foundation for expanding my territory. However, over the next several days, our patrols found only old tracks. Most refugees instinctively fled toward open plains and Baron Bolton's castle rather than deep into the mountains. I realized that honest, hardworking families stumbling into our remote valley were rare. While slightly disappointed, I knew this isolation kept our settlement hidden and safe from dangerous mobs. Back at the outpost, Mary prepared breakfast over the outdoor stone stove. She stirred coarse rye flour into boiling water, creating a thick, steaming porridge. I sat inside on my deerskin couch and received the thickest portion, complete with reheated smoked venison. This preserved meat was a vital reserve and a privilege of my rank, something the serfs never dared covet. When Oliver returned with a plump hare from our traps, I cut off the hind legs for myself and instructed Mary to stew the rest in the main pot. The melting rabbit fat enriched the rye porridge, filling the yard with a rich aroma. Thomas received his family's portion with deep reverence. In this brutal year of war and starvation, finding a master who provided warm shelter, thick rye porridge, and rich broth was an absolute blessing. Overcome with gratitude for our protection, Thomas finished his bowl and immediately rushed back to clear the fields with even greater vigor. I had grown tired of eating sour rye porridge and tough flatbreads every day. Furthermore, with Thomas's family now living at the outpost, our growing population gathered around my private hearth for every meal. To restore order and establish a proper food processing center, I decided to construct an outdoor communal bread oven. In the feudal manor system, a communal oven was a symbol of lordly authority, separating the workers' dining space from my private quarters. After breakfast, I marked out a circle on the ground east of the cabin and instructed Thomas to begin building. Thomas carried dozens of flat river stones from the stream, stacking them with damp red clay to create a waist-high base. Seeing how heavy the work was, I rolled up my sleeves to help him lift a massive bluestone slab. To my surprise, Thomas rushed over in utter panic, pushing my hands away from the rock. He begged me not to dirty my fine clothes with menial labor, insisting that heavy tasks were meant only for serfs. Looking over, I saw Mary kneeling in the mud in sheer terror. I realized that, in their strict feudal mindset, a knight doing manual labor signaled that their master considered them useless, or that all order had collapsed. Accepting that my role was to command rather than perform brute labor, I stepped back with my hand on my sword hilt and directed the construction from a distance. Relieved, Thomas hoisted the heavy stone onto his shoulder with renewed energy. Following my instructions, Mary and Lucy chopped leftover rye straw and stomped it into the red clay with their bare feet to create an elastic, crack-resistant mortar. Thomas used the mixture to bind the stone base and formed a dome using arched willow branches as a frame. By sunset, a sturdy half-person-high red clay bread oven stood complete in the yard. This oven would allow us to bake durable loaves of black bread to store for winter, while keeping the daily commotion of cooking away from my cabin. While letting the newly built red clay oven dry in the autumn breeze, I prepared a natural sourdough starter by mixing rye flour with stream water and leaving it near the warm hearth for 2 days to ferment. Once the starter bubbled with a rich, sour aroma, I directed Mary to pour our unsifted rye flour into a wooden trough. I added a pinch of salt and a spoonful of rendered deer fat, instructing her to work water in slowly. Mary kneaded the heavy, sticky dough with all her strength until it formed a massive, glossy, dark mass. I then covered it with a damp cloth and set it by the hearth to ferment overnight so the bread would not turn out rock hard. Meanwhile, Thomas crafted smooth, long-handled wooden bread peels to slide the loaves into the oven. Before dawn, the fermented dough had expanded nicely with countless tiny air pockets. I instructed Mary to shape it into palm-sized rounds, while I lit a gentle fire of glowing embers and pine needles inside the dried oven. This low heat forced out residual moisture from the clay walls, and I quickly patched any emerging cracks with fresh mud. After an hour of heating, the oven interior turned whitish and hot. I had Oliver scrape out all the burning embers and ash, trapping the pure residual heat within the thick mud walls. Mary arranged the heavy dough balls, and I used the greased peel to slide them one by one into the baking chamber. The stone base sizzled as it sealed in moisture, I blocked the oven entrance with a flat bluestone slab and sealed the rim with wet clay. 2 hours later, after the aroma of caramelized starch and rich fat filled the air, I pried open the stone door. A wave of sweet roasted steam rushed out. Using the peel, I scooped out the loaves onto a clean linen sheet. The dark purple loaves were dense, heavy, and shielded by a thick, charred crust that sounded like hard wood when tapped. In the cold air, slight cracks opened across the crusts, releasing hot steam from the genuine wheat inside. Unlike the adulterated bread filled with sand and chaff on typical feudal manners, our loaves were wholesome, nourishing, and made with pure grain, salt, and fat. I instructed Mary to brush water over the crusts of the freshly baked loaves, so they would not crack and could be preserved longer. Breaking open a warm loaf, I found the fermented crumb dense, chewy, and rich with grain sweetness. Taking the first bite as Lord, I then distributed the bread among the others. Oliver shared his warm portion with Lucy, while Thomas savored every morsel under his eaves, amazed by the pure quality compared to the dust-filled, rock-hard bread of northern manners. With our bellies full, we immediately turned our attention to the southern field. The oats hung heavy with grayish-white ears, and the broad bean pods had withered to a dry brown. I ordered Thomas to harvest the crops with his sickle. Oliver bundled the cut stalks, Lucy collected the fallen ears, and Mary carried the loads to the cabin. I planned to dry the broad beans on stone slabs, knowing their high protein value and how their cultivation enriched the soil for future rye rotations. Over 2 days of intensive labor, we brought in the entire harvest. Thomas used the oat stalks to thicken the roofs of both the main cabin and his family's shelter, providing crucial insulation against the approaching winter frost. I stored the harvested broad beans safely in our cracked ceramic urn, instructing Oliver to keep a portion of the oats unground as emergency rations and future livestock feed. That night, as the cold wind whistled through the thatch, I gathered everyone to issue vital orders for our winter preparations. First, I directed Thomas to fell mature pine trees to stockpile dry firewood up to the eaves, while keeping our charcoal kiln burning for smokeless heat. Second, I placed strict limits on our food rations. I ordered Mary to grind fixed portions of rye and oats together without discarding the bran, while saving our broad beans strictly for the coldest midwinter days. Finally, I addressed our defense against intruders. With displaced refugees and desperate bandits fleeing south from the Viking advance, I instructed Oliver to patrol the perimeter fences with me twice daily, treating any unknown tracks as a hostile threat. I also ordered Thomas to shift his family's hut closer to the main cabin and reinforce its walls with thick clay and straw. With clear rules and full stores, our small settlement was ready to stand as a fortified haven through the harsh winter. To keep up my strength and maintain my authority as lord of this territory, I needed to secure a large supply of fresh red meat and fat before winter set in. Taking down a wild boar that had spent the autumn fattening on acorns would inspect our boundaries, replenish our larder, and demonstrate my martial strength to the serfs. Leaving the cabin, I gestured for Oliver to grab his fire-hardened wooden spear and follow me into the southern broadleaf woods. Tracking through the crisp fallen leaves, we arrived at a muddy stream where I spotted fresh, basin-sized hoofprints marked with stiff black bristles. A large, solitary boar had just moved upwind toward the oak groves. We stalked the animal to the mountainside and found it, rooting in the frozen earth through a dense patch of hazelwood. The beast was enormous, covered in needle-like bristles and equipped with a lethal pair of yellowish tusks. Unlike timid red deer that fled when startled, wild boars were aggressive and unpredictable killers, whose thick layers of resin, mud, and fat could deflect inferior weapons. I signaled Oliver to take cover behind a tree trunk. Drawing back my sinew-reinforced ash longbow, I aimed a heavy iron-nailed arrow directly at the thin patch of skin behind its front ribs. As the boar lifted its snout to catch our scent, I released the bowstring. The arrow struck its left side with a heavy thud. Enraged and shielded from lethal damage by its thick subcutaneous fat, the wounded beast let out a shrill roar and charged straight toward my position. I cast my bow aside, drew my arming sword, and sidestepped its furious charge, causing the boar to crash into a birch tree. Oliver bravely stepped in and thrust his wooden spear into the beast's shoulder to stall its momentum. The wood failed to pierce bone and snapped, but the distraction gave me the opening I needed. I closed the distance, grabbed the bristles on its back, and drove my arming sword deep behind its ear into the skull. The massive beast thrashed violently beneath my grip before finally collapsing dead in the mud. Gasping in the cold air, I inspected our prize. The firm layers of white fat and heavy pork would provide essential calories, tool lubrication, and tough leather to carry us through the coming freeze. Since the carcass was far too heavy for the two of us to carry, I told Oliver to fetch vines from our traps and run back to camp to bring Thomas to help haul the meat home. Thomas arrived quickly with Oliver and was astonished by the size of the massive wild boar. He praised my strength, noting that hunting such a beast in the northern states usually required a team of 5 or 6 men with long spears. We tied the carcass to a thick oak pole and carried it straight back to our fortified yard, no longer fearing lone wolves, now that our settlement had more men and solid walls. Back at camp, Mary had already prepared boiling stream water in our large earthenware pot. We hung the boar upside down from the cabin beam, using clean clay bowls to catch the valuable blood. Using the polished dagger I took from the bandit leader, I skillfully skinned the carcass and sliced away the thick layer of white subcutaneous fat. With Thomas and Mary assisting, the butchering proceeded rapidly. Mary washed the intestines and stacked the cleaned organs, while Thomas arranged the ribs and legs. Unlike my hurried deer hunt, we salvaged nearly every scrap, boosting our yield by 30%. Seeing the couple laboring tirelessly with mud and blood on their clothes, I decided to reward them. I granted Thomas the pig's heart, lungs, and leftover trimmings. On typical feudal manners, lords gave offal only to hunting hounds, so Thomas and Mary fell to the ground in overwhelming gratitude for this life-saving gift before rushing to the stream to clean the meat for their family. I turned to rendering lard over the outdoor stone stove. I melted the chopped fat in the hot pot, slowly stirring the bubbling oil for over an hour until it yielded crispy golden cracklings and jars of clear grease. Once cooled, this pure white lard would serve as our primary source of calories, tool lubricant, and lamp fuel through the winter. Nearby, Oliver tended the smoking rack, turning the cuts of fatty pork while I fed damp pine wood into the embers to envelop the meat in thick, preserving smoke. Eating a warm, crispy crackling by the fire, I looked at our brimming food jars and smoking racks with deep satisfaction. Our hard work had filled the larder, leaving us fully prepared for the freezing winter ahead. In the late autumn of 867, after destroying Northumbria, the Danish Great Heathen Army did not remain in York for the winter. Instead, they pushed south along the rivers, seized the key stronghold of Nottingham, and prepared to winter there. With the Vikings entrenched nearby, the surrounding countryside faced widespread pillaging, which explained the surge of refugees fleeing into the mountains. King Burgred of Mercia was left in sheer panic and turned to Wessex for aid, while local nobles like Baron Bolton were consumed with mobilizing troops and fortifying their own castles. Realizing that Baron Bolton was too distracted to police the wilderness, I saw both opportunity and danger. The Viking invasion had shattered the old feudal order, rendering the crime of illegally occupying land essentially meaningless. As a knight and a Christian, reclaiming land and providing sanctuary gave me a legitimate foundation to expand amidst the chaos. If I could endure the storm, this valley would become the cornerstone of my power. However, the threat remained lethal. The Vikings would ruthlessly plunder any Saxon settlement they found. To survive, I resolved that this cliffside outpost had to evolve into a true fortification. In the coming spring, using the natural rock wall as our rear defense, I planned to replace our deadwood fences with tall rammed earth ramparts topped by wooden walkways. To accomplish this, I needed far more manpower. Thomas's family was a vital start, but I needed 10 to 20 more hardworking families to farm the land and form a garrison of spearmen in times of crisis. With my knowledge of agriculture, crop rotation, and survival, I was determined to rise from a wandering knight into a powerful ruler controlling the fate of the realm. Taking stock of our current settlement, our total population consisted of 2 adult men, 1 adult woman, a squire boy, and 2 young children. Our arsenal included my arming sword, a Viking hand axe, a reinforced longbow with 6 iron-tipped heavy arrows, a captured dagger, 2 hardwood spears, a suit of half chainmail, a dented iron helmet, and a leather-covered round shield. Our grain stores held 190 kilograms of rye, 60 kilograms of hulled oats, and 40 kilograms of dried broad beans. For meat and fat, we had 30 kilograms of smoked venison, approximately 100 kilograms of smoked wild boar, and 8 kilograms of rendered lard, supported by 30 kilograms of salted cabbage and a jar of salt. Our essential tools included a rotary stone mill, a red clay bread oven, an iron-shod shovel, a hoe, a sickle, and a few iron nails. With these provisions secured, we stood ready to endure the brutal winter ahead. Outside my cabin, Thomas and his family huddled inside their new thatched hut around a small fire, wrapping themselves in straw and old cloaks to endure the biting autumn night. I allowed them to collect fallen branches freely each day, because keeping my laborers warm and healthy was far more important than saving firewood. Mary cooked the rewarded wild boar offal with rye bran into a rich, steaming soup. The hearty fats provided direct body heat, visibly improving the health of their young son, Rian. Filled with immense gratitude for finding shelter and generous food, the couple prayed for my long life and vowed to work hard. Meanwhile, I spent the evening inside the cabin processing the massive wild boar hide. As the only person in our settlement with leatherworking skills, I understood the great protective value of this thick skin. While soft deerskin served well as garment lining, this dense boar hide was tough enough to deflect arrows and glancing blows from wrought iron weapons. Kneeling on the floor, I used my captured dagger to carefully scrape away residual flesh and fat, saving every shaving for future rendering. My plan was to treat the hide in alkaline water and fashion it into a sturdy cuirass and greaves to wear over my chainmail for the coming conflicts. However, two major challenges weighed heavily on my mind. First, with Nottingham fallen to the Vikings, thousands of displaced serfs, deserters, and armed vagrants would flee south through our mountain trails. While I needed more honest farmers like Thomas to expand my workforce, our cabin and its rising smoke would also attract starving bandits. I had to remain vigilant with my arming sword to defend my people and our supplies. Second, our trade prospects faced severe disruption. We had less than a pound of salt remaining, which was critically needed to preserve our massive stores of wild boar meat. Salt, iron, tools, and cloth could not be gathered from the forest. With the surrounding territory turning into an active war zone, southern merchant caravans would stop traveling to our regional market 2 days away. Even if trading continued, the purchasing power of my 3 remaining silver coins would plunge as merchants hoarded essential iron and salt, while the flood of refugees would make ordinary furs nearly worthless. I knew that stumbling upon a rich open-pit salt mine in the wilderness was unrealistic. In medieval England, high-quality salt wells and mineral deposits were heavily guarded and controlled by the crown, bishops, or local counts. With war spreading and trade routes cut off, I could not rely on distant, dangerous markets. Instead, I considered 2 practical methods to produce dietary sodium: locating wild animal salt licks to leach mineral salts, or finding natural brine springs. Central England, particularly the Mercia region, sits atop deep Triassic salt deposits that occasionally feed groundwater springs. While usable brine springs were strictly guarded by lords, highly impure bitter springs were completely abandoned. These springs contained high amounts of magnesium and calcium, which made the water taste foul and caused severe sickness. Without chemical knowledge, medieval folk avoided them. However, with my modern understanding, I could easily remove these bitter minerals by mixing the brine with potassium carbonate derived from wood ash, leaving behind clean, pure salt. The next morning, I questioned Thomas about the path he took along the mountain stream. I asked if he had spotted any barren ground or rock fissures encrusted with white mineral deposits. Thomas immediately recalled a location about an hour's walk upstream past the Great Rock Wall. He described a small spring emerging from a lightning-split rock. The locals called it a bitter spring, believing it was cursed by demons because the astringent water burned the throat, killed surrounding vegetation, and caused terrible diarrhea. Hearing this description, I was delighted. What the locals considered a demonic curse was simply brine with heavy magnesium and calcium content, an overlooked resource free of lordly guards. I ordered Oliver to grab 2 large earthenware pots and instructed Thomas to lead us directly to the cursed spring. Though Thomas was bewildered by the idea of turning bitter water into precious salt, he obediently led the way into the morning mist. Following the mountain stream upstream for about 15 minutes, we arrived at a cliff face where the pleasant woodland scent gave way to a dry, sulfurous odor. At the base of the rock wall, A clear stream trickled from a fissure into a deep pool. The surrounding rocks were coated in thick white crystals, and all the nearby shrubs were withered and dead. Touching a sample to my tongue, I tasted an intense burst of salt mixed with spicy, numbing bitterness. It was an exceptionally concentrated natural brine spring, bitter only because of its high magnesium content. Oliver was terrified, calling it the devil's saliva, and warning me that northern lords considered such springs poisonous. I reassured him that nobles avoided it, only because they lacked the knowledge to extract the salt from the toxins. I ordered them to fill both earthenware jars and carry the brine back to the outpost. Back at the cabin, I set up a filter by lining an empty pot with fine linen and clean river sand to strain out mud and debris. Next, I took the fine hardwood ash sifted by Mary, mixed it with water into a slurry rich in potassium carbonate, and poured it into the filtered brine. Immediately, white flakes formed and settled to the bottom of the pot. To the watching serfs, this chemical precipitation looked like pure magic. I explained that the diarrhea-causing toxins had simply bonded into solid sediment. After letting the mixture settle for 30 minutes, I decanted the clear liquid into another jar and placed it over the stone stove to boil. Once the water nearly evaporated, I used the residual heat to dry the remaining crystals. Scraping the bottom with a wooden spoon revealed a layer of sparkling white crystals. I tasted a pinch, finding only pure clean saltiness. Thomas tasted it in disbelief and bowed in deep reverence, praising my ability to turn poisonous water into gold. However, the process was labor-intensive. Boiling that single jar took an entire afternoon and burned a massive bundle of firewood, yielding only a small handful of salt. While this output was insufficient for mass trade or large-scale meat curing, it secured our personal dietary needs and eliminated the dangerous trek to distant markets. I instructed Thomas and Oliver to fetch a few more jars of brine the next morning, while keeping our primary focus on fortifying the cabin and fences for winter. Watching Thomas and Oliver struggle to carry the heavy jars of bitter spring water by hand, I saw how quickly this primitive method depleted their strength. Without draft animals, transporting water, firewood, and future building materials would inevitably crush their spines. To solve this immediate problem, I selected a straight, elastic piece of ash wood and carved a carrying pole. I flattened the center to distribute weight evenly across the shoulders, tapered both ends, and cut deep notches to hold vine cords. Demonstrating the tool to Thomas, he was astonished by how the springy wood absorbed the load, allowing one person to easily carry twice as much. However, carrying poles still relied entirely on human stamina, which had its limits. In the rugged, muddy forests of Britain, large two-wheeled Roman carts were useless because they easily overturned on roots and narrow paths. Instead, I decided to construct a single-wheeled handcart with a centrally balanced load. By placing a large wooden wheel in the middle and mounting cargo racks on either side, the entire weight would rest directly on the axle. The person pushing would only need to balance and steer, rather than lift hundreds of pounds. I instructed Thomas to gather dense, seasoned oak heartwood to craft the wheel. Because iron was scarce, I planned an all-wood prototype. Rather than slicing across a single log, which would easily split, I shaped 4 thick fan-shaped oak planks joined with interlocking ash wood wedges. To bond the joints securely, Oliver and I collected raw pine resin from the forest. I melted the resin in a clay bowl by the fire, mixing in fine charcoal powder to increase hardness and a touch of lard for elasticity. This created a thick, powerful black pitch. I coated the wood joints generously with the hot adhesive and directed Thomas to hammer the ash wedges deep into the mortises with a stone mallet. The pitch squeezed through the seams and hardened rapidly in the freezing wind, binding the 4 oak segments into a solid, heavy-duty wheel. While I focused on assembling the wooden wheelbarrow, Thomas and Oliver took turns using the ash wood carrying pole to haul brine from the cliff. At the outdoor stone stove, Oliver and Mary mixed wood ash milk into the murky salt water to precipitate impurities, continuously boiling and scraping the residue. Within a few days, we accumulated 6 kilograms of clean, off-white mineral salt. This supply was plenty for our daily winter meals, and it left enough extra to cure 2 large wild boar hind legs for long-term storage. Meanwhile, I completed the wheelbarrow. Lacking spare iron, I relied on mortise and tenon oak joints, wooden wedges, black pine resin pitch, and lard-soaked vines to reinforce the frame. I wrapped the outer rim in tough wild boar hide to shield the wood from sharp rocks. I placed 2 iron washers made from my last nail at the critical axle point, but the wooden axle still rotated directly inside the frame. To test its balance, I had Thomas and Oliver load over 100 pounds of firewood onto the side racks. Thomas gripped the ash handles and pushed the cart across the uneven ground. The centrally balanced load moved smoothly along the narrow paths, and the wrapped boar hide resisted the rough gravel. I warned Thomas not to push too fast to avoid overheating the wooden axle. Next, we put the cart to real work, hauling heavy pine logs felled behind the cabin. We stacked meter-long logs up to waist height on both sides of the central wheel, loading nearly 200 pounds of timber. Oliver cleared rocks ahead, while Thomas balanced and pushed from behind. Because the center of gravity rested directly over the axle, Thomas only needed to stabilize the handles while rolling forward. What normally would have taken 3 men an entire afternoon was finished in just 4 quick trips. Thomas was amazed, declaring the cart more efficient than 5 strong men. Inspecting the oak axle, I noted slight surface friction wear, but the joints remained solid. I applied a generous dollop of lard to lubricate the axle points, quieting the friction noise. Looking at the gray, misty mountain sky, I knew the first winter snowfall was imminent. This simple wooden wheelbarrow would allow us to stockpile all our remaining winter fuel and red clay just in time. The first snow fell silently overnight. Stepping outside into the biting morning air, I saw the valley covered in a pristine layer of white frost and snow. Over the past 2 weeks, our settlement had worked relentlessly to prepare for the freeze. Thomas had used the wheelbarrow to haul loads of red clay, oat straw, and brine up the hill before the ground froze solid. Meanwhile, my pottery firing skills had improved considerably, producing denser, crack-free vessels. I called Thomas over and rewarded his family with 2 smooth earthenware jars and 4 thick clay bowls. He accepted the warm pottery with trembling hands, deeply grateful for household goods that only respectable folk possessed in traditional manners. Under the cabin eaves, our split firewood stood stacked to the roof beams, ensuring we could stay warm and cook without venturing out into the freezing wind. With full food urns and ample fuel, the anxiety that had weighed on me for months finally vanished. I took my longbow and had Oliver bring his spear to accompany me on a stroll along the snowy ridge. Tracking game was effortless on the fresh snow. Near a sheltered hazelwood thicket, Oliver spotted fresh rabbit tracks. Following the trail to a rocky crevice, I found a hare digging through the snow 30 paces away. Drawing my sinew-reinforced bow, I released a nail-tipped arrow that struck the target cleanly. Watching Oliver excitedly retrieve the game, I began thinking about long-term settlement plans, particularly livestock breeding. Having a steady supply of domesticated animals would stabilize our diet without relying on hunting luck. However, wild forest creatures presented serious challenges. Wild rabbits were fragile, easily stressed to death, and capable of burrowing out of standard wooden pens. Red deer required vast grazing grounds and could easily leap over our low fences. Wild boars were far too violent to enclose, and their heavy appetites would consume precious grain reserves needed for our people. Recognizing that taming wild forest beasts was impractical until our crop yields expanded, I set the idea aside. For now, our full granaries and fortified camp guaranteed a secure, peaceful winter. Domesticated livestock like cattle and sheep were vital on established estates for plowing and producing wool and milk. However, purchasing young animals from outside manors was far too dangerous under Viking occupation. Inquiring about livestock would expose our settlement to bandits and raiders. Instead of large livestock, wild pheasants were the most practical animals to domesticate. They required no large pastures, consumed minimal feed, and could thrive on the leftover bran and chaff from our stone mill. Furthermore, raising them would yield a steady supply of fresh eggs by spring to diversify our monotonous diet. I took Oliver to search the snowy woods for active pheasants, hoping to capture live birds before the coming blizzard sealed the mountain passes. Unfortunately, the deep snow had driven the game into hiding, and we returned empty-handed, prepared to delay our plans until spring. When we reached the cabin, Mary greeted us with great excitement. While gathering firewood behind the rocky cliff, she discovered 5 fist-sized pheasant chicks huddled inside a crevice. Their mother had likely frozen or been taken by predators, leaving the shivering brood to die. Realizing that young chicks would be far easier to tame and domesticate than wary adults, I immediately brought them inside near the stone stove. I ordered Oliver to collect fine rye bran from the mill and mix it with warm water and a little lard into a soft, nutrient-rich paste. Using a flat sliver of ash wood, I carefully fed the dying chicks one by one. The warm aroma of grain and fat triggered their survival instincts, and they swallowed the paste eagerly. As the nourishing food warmed their bellies, the chicks regained their strength, with the strongest among them standing up and chirping clearly. I instructed Mary to raise a warm stone slab by the hearth and place their straw-lined basket on top, ensuring they stayed comfortably warm without overheating. If we nursed these 5 chicks through the winter, they would provide fresh meat and nutritious eggs by spring. These rescued birds officially became the very first domesticated livestock of our cliffside settlement. The pheasant chicks were extremely fragile, and a single draft of freezing autumn air could kill them. I directed Thomas to weave a low enclosure from flexible hazelwood twigs beside our stone stove, line it with thick rye straw, and cover it with a woven lid to keep the chicks from jumping into the embers. In traditional English manners, serfs frequently lived in the same cramped huts as their livestock for warmth. However, I refused to tolerate animal stench, droppings, and fleas in my cabin. I permitted the chicks to stay indoors, only until they grew proper feathers, resolving to move them outside once they matured to preserve proper hygiene and my dignity as lord. Because Mary had discovered the brood, I officially appointed her as the settlement breeder. I arranged for Oliver to supply her with daily bran from our stone mill to feed them. Mary accepted the duty with immense gratitude. In medieval manor hierarchy, caring for lordly livestock was a coveted privilege that elevated a serf's status, guaranteed long-term security, and allowed her family to keep secondary byproducts like warm down feathers. Soon after, heavy snow completely buried the valley under 2 feet of drifts, sealing the passes. We halted our outdoor patrols, only stepping out to shovel pathways while keeping the indoor hearth burning steadily. Under Mary's attentive care, all 5 chicks grew rapidly, replacing their sparse down with tough feather quills. The boldest rooster even perched on the basket rim to peck at my boots. With field labor impossible during the freeze, we focused on maintaining our gear inside the warm cabin. I reinforced my ash longbow with oil-soaked deer sinew and carved hardened antler fittings. Nearby, Thomas worked diligently on our soaked wild boar hide. He pulled and rubbed the thick skin over a smooth pine beam to break the stiff fibers. I encouraged him to knead it thoroughly, reminding him that properly softened leather would create armor strong enough to stop stray arrows. Meanwhile, Mary used stiff wild boar bristles to craft fine brushes, which would sweep away leftover flour from our stone mill and prevent any waste of our precious grain. In the middle of the snowy night, the faint clinking of our ceramic tripwire alarm echoed from the hazelwood thicket. I woke Oliver quietly, warning him that something was moving outside. Driven by winter starvation, a pack of wolves had tracked the scent of smoke and meat to our settlement. Outside the door, low growls and the sound of sharp claws scratching against our wooden fence broke the silence. Inside his thatched hut, Thomas shouted in terror, fearing the beasts would breach our perimeter. Remaining completely calm, I put on my heavy half-chainmail, fastened my iron helmet, and drew my arming sword. I ordered Oliver to ignite pine torches soaked in lard, casting bright flames across the yard. Stepping out into the snow, I thrust the torch over the palisade to assess the threat. 4 emaciated wolves stood outside in the cold, led by a large, hunched alpha. Seeing their visible ribs and frost-covered fur, I knew hunger had made them desperate, but their animal instincts still made them fear fire and our solid barrier. Thomas stepped out of his hut gripping a hoe, his initial panic easing once he saw me standing fully armored. I told him not to worry, because the wolves could not cross our fortifications. I felt deeply relieved that I had taken the time to build sturdy, tall fences rather than cutting corners. My only concern was avoiding any accidental bites in the dark, as deep wounds and subsequent infections could easily prove fatal in the middle of winter. The wolves refused to leave immediately. The alpha paced back and forth, howling to urge the others forward while their glowing green eyes watched us from the shadows. Refusing to waste our precious body heat in a freezing standoff, I decided to eliminate the pack leader to scatter the rest. I instructed Oliver to fetch my ash longbow. Taking a steady stance behind a narrow gap in the fence, I knocked a finely fletched heavy arrow. Drawing the bowstring back with all my strength, I locked my aim onto the snarling alpha wolf and released the shot into the snowy night. My heavy, iron-tipped arrow struck the alpha wolf directly through its eye socket, dropping the beast instantly into the snow. Terrified by the sudden death of their leader, the remaining 3 wolves turned and fled deep into the dark woods. I stepped outside, pulled my blood-stained arrow from the carcass, and ordered Thomas to skin and butcher the animal. Under the laws of Mercia, wolves were considered public pests rather than protected game, meaning anyone could freely hunt them and keep their meat and pelts. I inspected our perimeter palisade by torchlight. Although the base of the stakes showed deep scratches and bite marks from desperate claws, the wooden barrier stood rock solid without wobbling. Back inside the warm cabin, Oliver carefully wiped down the retrieved arrow while casting admiring glances at my longbow. Gathering his courage, the boy asked if he could learn archery to help me defend the settlement from future attacks. In typical feudal manners, archery was strictly reserved for nobility and designated huntsmen, and commoners risked severe punishment for even handling weapons. However, Oliver had proven himself loyal, hardworking, and brave during every crisis. I recognized that training him as a true knight squire would provide vital ranged support for our expanding outpost. I agreed to teach him once the snowfall subsided, warning him that drawing a war bow required intense discipline and endurance. Overjoyed, Oliver bowed deeply and pledged his complete dedication. I began his training by teaching him proper weapon maintenance. I demonstrated how to rub solid lard into the ashwood and deer sinew fibers to keep the bow supple in freezing weather, preventing the brittle wood from snapping. Looking at Oliver's young frame, I knew my 50-pound draw bow was far too heavy and could easily injure his growing joints. I decided to salvage the tough sinew from the dead wolf to craft a lighter 30-pound bow suited for his practice. I then directed him to use our sandstone whetstone to polish away any rust spots on the iron arrowheads without damaging the shafts. Within half an hour, we finished skinning and deboning the wolf carcass. Although wolf meat was tough and gamey, every ounce of protein was valuable. I kept the tough tendons for toolmaking and decided to reward Thomas for his bravery during the attack. Even though he had been terrified, he had still stepped forward with a hoe to help defend the settlement. I granted him the wolf's hind leg and ribs. Deeply honored by the recognition and the generous gift of meat, Thomas bowed with sincere gratitude. The next morning, with snow piling thicker outside, I began Oliver's archery training by crafting him a suitable weapon. I retrieved a 5-foot elm branch that had been seasoning above the hearth for 3 months. I explained to Oliver that heavy war bows required decades of grueling training to master, so he needed a lighter weapon suited to his developing frame. Using my dagger, I carefully shaved down the elm wood, tapering the ends into smooth limbs, while leaving the center thick for a solid grip. To increase the bow's power and cast without making the draw weight too heavy, I reinforced the elm core. I softened the dried wolf sinews in warm water and bonded them to the back of the bow using melted pine resin. With this sinew backing, the 30-pound bow would shoot arrows with impressive range and speed. Once the glue was set, I sent Oliver to grind grain at the mill while the bow dried in the shade. Next, I prepared practice ammunition. I selected straight birch branches, heated them near the stove to true the shafts, and fashioned practice points from deer bone fragments. I shaped the bone shards into sharp, triangular tips using an axe and whetstone, then slotted them into the wood and bound them tightly with hemp cord. These bone-tipped arrows were cheap to produce and ideal for target practice. Finally, I crafted proper gear for myself using leftover strips of deerskin. Using a bone awl and linen cord, I assembled a wide diagonal baldric fitted with a secure scabbard mount. Strapping it over my chainmail, my arming sword hung firmly against my left hip without shifting during movement, allowing me to draw instantly in battle. A sudden cry from the cabin broke my focus as I worked on my gear. Rushing to our grain store, I found our worst nightmare, a devastating rat infestation. While our 2 massive ceramic urns of rye flour remained sealed and safe under clay lids, our later harvests of oats and broad beans had been left in porous wicker baskets and open piles. Uncovering the straw, I was met with the foul stench of rodent urine and decay. The rats had chewed through the sacks, tunneled through the grain, and left droppings everywhere. Contact with the damp earthen floor had turned the bottom layers of grain into a slimy, gray-white mold. I immediately ordered everyone to salvage what we could. Oliver shoveled the ruined oats into waste bags, while Thomas, Mary, and Lucy sifted through the remaining beans to separate the clean food from contaminated scraps. We threw the fouled straw outside into the snow. It infuriated me that after working so hard to secure our settlement against wolves and bandits, we had nearly lost our winter food supply to underground pests. Realizing that simple earthen storage was a failure, I decided to build a deep, dry, and rodent-proof underground cellar near the rock wall. I marked out a 2-meter square on the ground and set to work with Thomas and Oliver. We used an iron shovel and a rusty pickaxe to break through the rock-hard topsoil. As we dug deeper, Oliver carried away baskets of excavated earth, while Thomas and I used thick wooden levers to pry out millstone-sized boulders. Over several grueling days, we excavated the pit to a depth of 1.5 meters. To stabilize the damp earthen walls and keep rodents from burrowing inside, I had Thomas gather flat river stones. We lined the pit walls with these stones, sealing every joint with thick red clay mixed with wood ash. The alkaline ash would act as a strong mortar and deter pests with its sharp scent. Finally, to ensure moisture would not ruin the grain from below, I avoided placing supplies directly on the dirt floor. Instead, I lined the bottom of the cellar with a thick layer of ceramic shards and crushed charcoal to absorb any rising groundwater. The finished cellar was 1.5 meters deep and 2 meters wide, offering ample space to store our grain baskets side by side. To ensure pests could not chew through the entrance, I constructed a solid cellar door using dense oak planks, joined with carved mortises and hardwood dowels. I softened scraps of leather in water and nailed them along the edges of the door. When closed, the thick leather compressed into the stone grooves, creating an airtight, insect-proof barrier. Before loading our food, I tested the defenses. I dragged my dagger firmly across the dried red clay walls, but the hardened clay and wood ash mixture showed only faint white scratches that no rodent teeth could penetrate. Satisfied with the mortar and tight stone joints, I ordered Thomas and Mary to haul over the heavy wicker baskets of hulled oats and broad beans. Oliver stood below in the pit, arranging each container tightly against the inner stone walls. Once all the food was lowered, the cabin floor became much more open and clean. Thomas and Oliver lifted the heavy 3-finger-thick oak hatch and dropped it squarely into the pre-cut stone recess. I checked the perimeter carefully, making sure the leather seal formed a tight fit with no drafts. Finally, I had them scatter dry straw over the hatch to conceal the disturbed earth from unwanted visitors. With our winter supplies safely secured underground, the anxiety in the room gave way to relief. To reward everyone for their exhausting labor, I instructed Mary to use our remaining pork cracklings and clean salt to make a rich porridge of crushed oats and rye. The hot, fatty meal restored our energy and lifted everyone's spirits. Thomas expressed his deep relief, knowing we no longer had to fear losing our grain. I outlined our tasks for the following day. Thomas would inspect and reinforce the firewood stacks under the eaves against heavy snow loads, while Oliver and I would check our snare traps along the forest perimeter. As the freezing north wind howled against the rocky cliff, our grain remained safely protected beneath our feet, ensuring our settlement could weather the harshest winter. The valley was buried in knee-deep snow, hiding our harvested fields and palisades beneath a desolate white expanse. While Thomas and Oliver worked inside the warm cabin, I went out on patrol to erase any smoke trails or footprints that might expose our settlement. Reaching a high ridge a mile south of the outpost, I spotted a trampled path cutting through the pristine snow. Concealing myself behind a snow-covered fir tree, I watched a group emerge from the mouth of the stream about 400 meters away. 4 burly Viking warriors were marching through the valley. They wore blackened wool cloaks, carried heavy round shields, and had large Danish axes strapped to their waists. Behind them trailed a line of about 10 captured Saxon villagers bound together with thick hemp ropes. The prisoners were exhausted, stumbling through the deep drifts while carrying heavy burlap sacks filled with looted grain. The Viking leader rode a sturdy northern pony, violently whipping the captives and shouting threats, while his men laughed callously. I recognized this was a scattered foraging party, gathering supplies and forced labor for the Viking garrison wintering in Nottingham. The sight of these raiders operating so close meant they were systematically bleeding the surrounding villages dry. Watching from the ridge, I carefully calculated my odds. The mounted leader was the greatest danger. If he realized an ambush was underway and fled on horseback, he would report my position and bring Nottingham's army down upon our valley. The other 3 warriors were heavily built and experienced, though they wore thick leather armor rather than chainmail. I possessed 3 heavy iron-tipped arrows. With a surprise attack, I could eliminate the mounted leader first and wound another, leaving the remaining 2 for close combat with my arming sword. It was a perilous gamble, but the potential reward was immense. The captive villagers represented an instant, skilled labor force, and the sacks of grain on their backs would feed them through the winter. Most valuable of all was the northern pony, which would provide vital draft power for my settlement. If I could wipe out this foraging party without letting a single man escape, my small outpost would immediately transform into a true miniature manor. Keeping my eyes locked on the targets, I readied myself to strike. I sprinted through the deep snow without slowing down, ignoring the burning pain in my lungs as I rushed back to the outpost. Because the Viking squad was heavily encumbered with captives and bulky grain sacks, their progress was slow. If we moved immediately, we could take a mountain shortcut, reach the narrow rocky pass ahead of them, and launch a devastating ambush before they realized we were there. Reaching the cabin, I called everyone inside to deliver the grave news. I told them that 4 armed Vikings were escorting a dozen prisoners along the road less than a mile away. The announcement struck immediate terror into the room. Mary hugged young Rian tightly in tears, while Thomas turned pale with dread. They knew all too well that the raiders brought only slaughter and burned homes. I explained that, although the raiders had not spotted us yet, it was only a matter of time before they discovered our valley. Waiting passively behind our wooden walls was a death sentence. Our only path to survival was striking first and eliminating every single one of them at the pass. Oliver stepped forward without hesitation. Gripping his sharpened wooden spear, he declared his loyalty and readiness to follow my lead into battle. Thomas, however, remained frozen in hesitation and fear. I did not force him, but I reminded him of the brutal reality. Our warm shelter, our grain urns, and our cured meats were irresistible prizes for starving raiders. If we failed or did nothing, the raiders would inevitably find the smoke, kill him, and destroy his family, just as they had done in his home village. My words shattered Thomas's hesitation. Remembering how the noble lords had abandoned commoners to the slaughter while hiding safely in their stone keeps, he realized he had nowhere left to run. Filled with the fierce desperation of a cornered beast, Thomas grabbed his heavy pickaxe and swore to risk his life to protect our home and food. Satisfied with their resolve, I retrieved my round boar skin shield and ordered Oliver to gather all our iron-tipped arrows. Fastening my iron helmet over my face, I led my men out into the blizzard, determined to reach the high ground and wipe out the enemy before they could escape the valley. Before departing, Mary held Thomas tightly and prayed for our victory, while Oliver comforted young Lucy by promising that under my protection, we would never be forced to wander the frozen wilderness again. Securing my quiver to my waist, I led the 2 men out into the snow toward our ambush site. We reached the narrow pass at the bend of the stream, where steep earthen slopes framed a rocky trail, only wide enough for 2 men abreast. After waiting for 15 minutes, the dark silhouettes of the Viking foraging party came into view. Burdensome cargo and exhausted captives had slowed their march to a crawl. Concealed behind a snow-covered boulder, I pulled my straightest heavy nail-tipped arrow from my quiver and inspected the sinew-wrapped bowstring. Thomas and Oliver crouched beside me, gripping their pickaxe and wooden spear with white-knuckled tension. I reviewed our battle plan one final time. They were strictly forbidden from charging into direct melee. My first arrow would take down the mounted commander to cause panic. Once he fell, Thomas and Oliver were to remain hidden behind the boulders, making as much noise as possible by shouting, banging tools, and throwing stones to create the illusion of a massive force encircling the woods, while I relocated to fire a second shot. The Viking squad stepped out onto the open, coverless gravel bed. The bearded leader, adorned in blue war paint and a bearskin collar, paused on his pony to roar curses at an exhausted captive. This exposed the side of his neck and collarbone. Drawing the sinew-backed ash longbow with all my strength, I locked my aim onto the mounted leader and released the string. The heavy arrow cut through the icy mist and drove deep into the raider's collarbone with a dull thud. The leader slumped and crashed off his mount into the snow like an empty sack. I immediately rolled backward to shift firing positions. The sudden strike plunged the enemy into chaos as the startled pony reared and dragged 2 tied prisoners into the mud. The 3 surviving Viking footmen reacted with veteran discipline, locking their round shields back to back and scanning the slope with raised axes. On cue, Oliver and Thomas raised a furious racket from the flank. They clashed their iron tools against the rocks, smashed heavy stones through branches, and shouted deep war cries. The deafening commotion echoed off the valley walls, tricking the raiders into believing dozens of armed ambushers were closing in from the trees. Down in the muddy valley, the captive villagers were completely terrified by the sudden violence. Hearing the heavy arrow strike and the dying screams of their captor, they did not flee. Instead, they instinctively huddled together in the deep snow, clutching their grain sacks to their chests and praying silently for mercy. The 3 surviving Vikings quickly overcame their initial shock. As seasoned raiders, they locked their heavy, leather-covered round shields together into a tight triangular shield wall, using the panicked pony to shield their flank. Crouching in the snow with axes drawn, they peered through the gaps and shouted fierce curses up the slope. Concealed behind the boulders, I searched for an opening. Their tight formation shielded their heads and torsos completely, and my homemade iron-nailed arrows could not pierce their thick shields head-on. Furthermore, I knew our deception would not last long. If this standoff continued, the raiders would realize that the loud commotion from Oliver and Thomas lacked real archery support. Exposing our tiny numbers, the raiders began to suspect our weakness. Locking their shields tighter, they slowly advanced up the slope toward my position. I adjusted my strategy, realizing that while their shields covered their upper bodies, their legs were exposed as they balanced in the deep snow. In this freezing wasteland, crippling a man's mobility was a guaranteed death sentence. I tracked their steps as they closed the distance. When the lead warrior stepped over a protruding root and shifted his weight, I leaned out from behind the rock and loosed another heavy arrow at a low angle. The shot bypassed the shield rim and drove straight through the knee joint of the warrior on the left. Screaming in agony, the raider collapsed forward, sending his shield tumbling down the snowy slope. In this era, a shattered knee guaranteed a slow, fatal infection, even if he survived the initial blood loss. With their shield wall broken and one man crippled in the snow, panic finally appeared in the eyes of the remaining 2 Vikings. Drawing my arming sword, I ordered Oliver and Thomas to shout at the top of their lungs to keep the pressure on. The long-range skirmish was over, and the final melee had begun. I gave the command to charge, and my voice echoed through the snowy valley. Oliver and Thomas burst out from the slopes with loud battle cries, rushing down through the deep snow with their sharpened spear and rusty pickaxe. Drawing my arming sword and locking my round shield in place, I strode forward in my chainmail to engage the remaining raiders. Seeing our small numbers and makeshift farm tools, the 2 standing Vikings sneered with disdain. The warrior carrying a round shield and short spear turned to intercept Thomas and Oliver, expecting to dispatch the 2 serfs with ease. Meanwhile, the black-bearded leader advanced directly toward me, swinging his heavy Danish war axe with terrifying momentum. I kept my center of gravity low and raised my boar-hide shield. As the distance closed, Blackbeard lunged and brought his heavy axe crashing down in a brutal arc. The impact slammed against my shield boss, sending shockwaves through my left arm and forcing my boots backward into the snow. The axe blade ripped through the outer leather and bit deep into the wooden base. Instead of withdrawing, Blackbeard threw all his weight onto the axe handle, trying to crush my guard and force me into the snow where my heavy armor would leave me helpless. I dug my right heel firmly behind a buried rock to arrest my slide. Shifting my left shoulder with a sharp twist, I angled the surface of the round shield to deflect his downward pressure. The heavy axe blade slipped off the rim and struck the ground, throwing Blackbeard completely off balance. With his upper body overextended and his hands locked low, the gap in the side of his hardened leather armor was left wide open. Seizing the opening, I stepped forward and thrust my arming sword directly beneath his ribs into his abdomen. The blade tore through his flesh with ease, and hot blood gushed over my gauntlet. The fierce light in Blackbeard's eyes instantly vanished as his strength drained away. His heavy battle axe dropped into the snow, and he collapsed forward along the length of my blade, falling dead at my feet in the frozen mud. On the other side of the clearing, Thomas and Oliver were locked in a desperate struggle. Even with a 2-on-1 advantage, their makeshift farm tools and lack of combat experience were no match for a veteran raider. The Viking slammed his heavy shield into Thomas, knocking him backward into the snow, and swept away Oliver's spear thrust with a powerful kick. Seeing their leader fall to my blade, the surviving warrior went completely berserk. Knowing he would soon be surrounded, he abandoned all defense to launch a reckless, suicidal assault. Raising his short spear, he lunged frantically toward Oliver's chest. Oliver held his ground with shaking legs, using the reach of his wooden spear to brace against the charge. Seizing the distraction, Thomas leaped up from the snow and swung his pickaxe with all his strength. Slipping slightly in the deep slush, his strike missed the warrior's head, but buried the iron tip deep into the Viking's right shoulder blade. The crushing blow crippled the raider's arm, sending his spear clattering into the mud. As the wounded Viking dropped his shield and reached for the hand axe at his belt, I charged in with a roar. Before his weapon was fully drawn, I swept my arming sword in a swift diagonal arc across his exposed throat. Blood sprayed across the snow, and he collapsed lifeless into the mud. The sudden silence of the valley was broken only by our heavy breathing and the groans of the crippled raider in the distance. Leaning on my blood-stained sword to catch my breath, I looked around at our trembling but triumphant group. The frightened pony was secured. The captive villagers watched in stunned silence, and the main skirmish was won. A dozen paces away, the final Viking sat in the snow with his shattered knee, his joint pierced by my heavy nail-tipped arrow. Unlike cowardly deserters who begged for mercy, this raider chose to face his end with defiant dignity. Gritting his teeth through the agony, he used his battle axe as a crutch to pull himself up onto his one good leg. He let out a raspy, final battle cry, refusing to drop his weapon. I signaled Oliver and Thomas to hold back. Respecting the warrior's resolve to fight to the last breath, I raised my arming sword and strode forward through the snow to deliver the final blow. Witnessing the sudden demise of their captors, the peasant prisoners stood in stunned silence before breaking into overwhelming tears of relief. They collapsed into the deep snow, weeping openly and murmuring heartfelt prayers to God for sending a knight in shining chainmail to deliver them from the brutal invaders. In this dark era of 867, a fully armored knight wielding a steel blade was a rare and sacred symbol of order, law, and military might. With royal authority crumbling, and their former lords having fled south after their villages were burned, my arrival seemed nothing short of miraculous. To these terrified survivors, my blood-stained armor was as comforting as a church cross against the northern raiders. As Thomas and Oliver stood proudly at my side with weapons in hand, the captives slowly moved toward us and knelt together in the slush. Their elder leader pressed his forehead to the frozen ground, weeping as he pleaded for shelter. He explained that their manor had been burned to the ground, and their lord had abandoned them. They begged to remain on my land, promising to serve faithfully, even as the lowliest laborers, just to survive the winter. They knew that without my protection, they would inevitably freeze in the wilderness, or be recaptured and slaughtered. I looked over the group of men and women clutching their grain sacks. Maintaining a calm and commanding authority, I declared that my word was the absolute law within this valley. I told them that our settlement accepted them as my tenant farmers, in exchange for their labor in tilling the soil, clearing land, and taking up spears to fortify the settlement. I promised to provide them with a warm hearth, hot soup, and winter rye. Most importantly, I vowed to use my sword to defend their lives whenever invaders threatened our borders. Overjoyed by the offer of sanctuary, the elder and the rest of the refugees bowed deeply, chanting fervent oaths of loyalty and gratitude. I accepted their allegiance as their rightful lord. Behind me, Thomas beamed with pride, while young Oliver stood wide-eyed, still feeling the thrilling rush of surviving his first real battle. With the refugees firmly under my command, I ordered my men to snap out of their daze and begin collecting the spoils of war. Approaching the fallen Viking leader, I gasped at his equipment. Beneath his cloak, he wore a complete blackened half-sleeved chainmail shirt and a sturdy iron helmet lined with thick wool felt. Touching the dense iron rings, I felt a lingering chill. If my initial ambush shot had failed to bring him down immediately, facing such a fully armored veteran in open melee would have been extremely dangerous. The other 3 warriors carried heavy leather armor, 2-handed Danish axes, barbed short spears, and single-handed fighting axes. Oliver and Thomas stripped the blood-stained chainmail and gathered the round shields with ecstatic shouts. In the markets of Mercia, this gear alone could buy an entire cartload of grain. Yet, while the armor and weapons were vital, the most valuable prize was the stocky northern pony standing nearby with 2 heavy grain sacks strapped to its back. In 9th century England, a horse was a premier strategic asset worth more than a dozen slaves. While my wooden wheelbarrow saved labor, harnessing this horse would multiply our transport capacity for stone, timber, and grain. Furthermore, it expanded our patrol range from a few miles to dozens, allowing us to spot enemy movements long before they reached our doorstep. For a wandering knight carving out an outpost in the wilderness, this mount was the ultimate tool to rebuild my authority and power. We stacked the spoils on the snow to take full inventory. Our haul included 1 fine half-length chainmail shirt, an iron helmet, 3 thick cowhide armors, 4 round shields, 2 long-handled Danish axes, a barbed spear, a balanced fighting axe, and 4 heavy fur coats. Searching the bodies, we also discovered field rations of dried salted fish, hard bean bread, smoked hazelnuts, a piece of bacon, and several Nordic silver coins. Looking at the mountain of steel, leather, and supplies, alongside the 10 rescued serfs and the pack pony, I could not hold back a triumphant laugh. Including Oliver and Thomas, my settlement now had a population of 16 people, 2 developing guards, and ample labor. In scale and strength, our hidden valley had officially grown into a self-sufficient miniature manor. Feeling a deep rush of pride, I ordered my men to gather our spoils and lead our new subjects back home. Under the fading crimson glow of the setting sun, I led our group back through the quiet snow-covered valley. The northern pony walked ahead, carrying our heavy captured armor and blood-stained axes. Behind us marched the 10 rescued farmers, with Thomas and Oliver flanking them like vigilant guards. Looking at the fine chainmail hanging from my saddle, I was amazed by the sheer scale of our plunder. In less than 15 minutes of fighting, we had secured a sturdy pack horse, 4 complete sets of weapons and armor, hundreds of kilograms of grain, and 10 able-bodied laborers. Accomplishing this through farming alone would have taken years of grueling work. The intoxicating thrill of plunder crossed my mind, but I quickly checked my thoughts. Relying on continuous violence was a dangerous trap. Warlords who lived solely by banditry were destined to fall to stronger forces or starve during famines. My true goal was to build an enduring castle and a stable manor anchored by sustainable farming, millstones, and established law. When we reached our outpost, Mary and Lucy were peering out nervously from behind the cabin door. Recognizing my dented iron helmet and armor, they rushed out into the snow with overwhelming relief. Seeing Thomas and Oliver return unharmed, Mary broke down in joyful tears, thanking God for their safe return, while little Lucy threw herself into Oliver's arms. In this brutal era, seeing their family members return alive from battle was the greatest blessing they could imagine. Nearby, our 10 new arrivals stood by the gate, looking in awe at our sturdy cabin, tall stacks of firewood, and hanging smoked meats. Having witnessed other lords flee and abandon their commoners to the raiders, they felt genuine hope and security under the protection of a lord who was willing to fight for his land. To prevent everyone from freezing in the bitter wind, I gently cut the reunion short. I instructed Mary to prepare a large pot of hot porridge for our newcomers. She rushed to the outdoor stone stove, combining coarse rye flour, crushed oats, and a generous scoop of white lard into boiling water. As the rich, steaming porridge filled the courtyard with the sweet aroma of grain and fat, we prepared to feed our growing settlement. The rich aroma of boiling rye porridge drew desperate glances from our newly rescued arrivals. They had carried those heavy grain sacks through the snow, purely as pack animals for their captors, never allowed a taste. Now seeing hot food prepared for them, several women wept with relief. Oliver stepped forward to maintain order, handing out carved ashwood bowls that Thomas had whittled during the winter downtime. Mary ladled generous portions of thick porridge topped with glistening rendered lard. When the elderly farmer received the first steaming bowl, his calloused hands shook violently as he gulped it down. I strictly rationed the food to a single full bowl per person, forbidding second helpings. Having witnessed the horrors of famine, I knew that starved stomachs turned frail and easily ruptured from sudden overeating. When one desperate man tried to bolt his food, I tapped his boot and warned him that eating too fast would kill him before any enemy could. He slowed down, sipping the warm, savory porridge while tears carved clean streaks down his grimy face. Seeing their guards lowered by warmth and food, I stepped into the center of the yard, resting my hand on my sword hilt. I called for silence and formally introduced myself. I announced that I was Adrian de Aquila, a royal knight and the rightful lord of this territory. I declared the motto of House Aquila: "Those who offend me will be punished." I promised that, as long as they worked my fields with unwavering loyalty, my sword would protect their families from wolves and Viking axes alike. Hearing my declaration, Oliver stood tall with pride. Thomas straightened his back with newfound authority, and the elderly farmer led the newcomers in bowing deeply to pledge their allegiance. I took inventory of the 10 new arrivals, who formed 5 distinct households. The group included the elderly farmer with decades of agricultural experience, 3 young couples whose strong frames would provide excellent muscle for clearing land and building stone walls once nourished, and a middle-aged couple with a 10-year-old boy. Standing at my hip, the boy was old enough to forage, 10 crops, and eventually train alongside Oliver as a capable guard. With their loyalty secured and their roles assessed, my woodland stronghold had gained the essential workforce needed to thrive. With the arrival of the newcomers, our small valley outpost had grown into a true miniature settlement, including myself, Thomas, Oliver, the 5 new families, and the children. Our total population reached 16 people. We now had 7 able-bodied men, 5 capable women, and 3 children. In a remote wilderness overlooked by both Baron Bolton and the invaders, our community was rapidly taking shape. I ordered Thomas to lead the newly arrived men to the stockpiles of straw and turf we had stored behind the cabin before the winter storms. Taking charge with newfound authority, Thomas guided the 6 men and the 10-year-old boy in raising A-frame wooden structures in sheltered pits outside the fence. Meanwhile, Mary worked with the new women to weave thick straw mats over the frames and seal the vents with red clay. By late night, 5 sturdy, pyramid-shaped thatched huts stood in a semicircle outside the yard, giving our exhausted new residents a warm place to sleep without fear. Returning to my cabin, I removed my blood-stained chainmail and took stock of our situation. The sudden expansion was a double-edged sword. On one hand, having 6 extra laborers meant my grand plans were no longer distant dreams. When the snow melted in the spring, I could mobilize this workforce to haul river stones, build real defensive ramparts along the rock face, and use the captured pony to plow 10 acres of fertile land. I could even equip the strongest men with captured leather armor and axes to form a dedicated patrol squad. On the other hand, 16 mouths would drain our food reserves at a rapid pace, while the captured grain sacks offset our immediate winter food pressure. Expanding our cultivated fields in the spring was an absolute necessity that could not be delayed. More importantly, analyzing the composition of the captured group raised a serious concern. In typical raids, invaders slaughtered the elderly and young children on the spot, spreading out captives by household, sparing non-combatants, and forcing them to carry their own food indicated that an invading lord nearby was intentionally gathering entire families for long-term taxation and agricultural labor. This meant a substantial permanent enemy settlement, or earldom, was already taking root near our valley, presenting a major long-term threat to my domain. The next morning, our new residents remained fast asleep in their warm thatched huts, enjoying their first peaceful rest in months. Outside in the snow, I laid out the clean spoils from our battle, now donning the superior long-sleeved chainmail taken from the fallen enemy leader. I called Oliver and Thomas forward to properly reward their loyalty and courage. I handed Oliver my old short-sleeved chainmail shirt, my dented iron helmet, an iron-tipped spear, and a sturdy round shield. Overjoyed, Oliver discarded his wooden stick and took up his new armor and weapons with immense pride, transforming from a ragged vagrant into a true squire. Turning to Thomas, I praised his timely strike during the battle, which had saved Oliver from death. I awarded him a suit of tough leather armor, a balanced one-handed battle axe, and a round shield. Furthermore, I made him a solemn promise: if he continued to serve House Aquila faithfully, I would personally grant him his freedom. and elevate him from serfdom. Overwhelmed by the promise of becoming a free man, Thomas nearly collapsed in tears, pledging his entire life to my service. I ordered both men to don their new gear immediately. Oliver pulled the heavy iron rings over his head, standing tall under the solid weight, while I adjusted his armor and placed the iron helmet firmly on his head. Thomas buckled the thick cowhide cuirass around his chest, slipped his arm into the shield strap, and tested the swing of his axe. Standing together in the morning mist, our core trio was completely transformed. With my fine mail and arming sword, Oliver's iron spear and mail, and Thomas's axe and shield, our small settlement possessed an elite, well-equipped armed backbone. We were no longer vulnerable refugees hiding in the mountains, but a formidable force ready to defend our growing domain. Seeing Oliver and Thomas standing proudly in their armor, I praised their transformed appearance. Facing real combat had sharpened their discipline and presence far beyond that of ordinary refugees. I ordered Mary to prepare black bread and hot soup for our newcomers, providing half a loaf per person. With 16 people now in the settlement, I could no longer manage every daily chore myself. A lord must focus on high-level decisions, defense, and order, delegating routine supervision to someone trusted. Thomas had proven his loyalty in battle and understood the peasant mindset better than anyone. I officially appointed him as head steward, placing him in charge of organizing field labor and directing the new serfs. Grateful and eager, Thomas accepted the responsibility and marched out to take command. Seeing Thomas leave, I asked Oliver if he felt any resentment about the appointment. Oliver shook his head without hesitation, explaining that managing field labor was Thomas's strength, while his own duty as my squire was to protect the cabin and guard my safety. Pleased with his loyalty and maturity, I told him that while Thomas secured our sustenance from the land, Oliver would become the weapon that defended it. I then instructed him to grab his round shield so we could begin training in defensive blocking techniques. Outside the fence, Thomas banged his axe against his shield to call the shivering newcomers to attention. With stern authority, he reminded them that while their former lords had fled, I had saved their lives, provided warm shelter, and fed them rich soup with meat. He warned them that idleness was forbidden on my land. He ordered the men and the young boy to chop pine trees in the woods to build a warm stable for our captured pony before the weather worsened. He directed the women to work with Mary, sorting the damp captured grain bags to grind good flour on the stone mill and feed spoiled grains to the pheasants. He made it clear that anyone who slacked off or stole grain would be cast out into the freezing forest for the wolves. Watching from the cabin doorway, I approved of Thomas's firm leadership. In this harsh era, strict boundaries, steady food, and clear authority were exactly what our new community needed to thrive. Thomas led our 6 new recruits into the woods to fell trees. The captured single-handed Viking axe and the 2 large Danish battle axes proved immensely useful. Although the long Danish axes were awkward for us to wield in battle due to their unfamiliar balance, they made exceptional tools for heavy logging. Thomas directed the men to harvest the thickest pine logs, so our new shelter would not buckle under winter snow. With multiple laborers working together with ropes and levers, moving the heavy timber became much faster. Behind the cabin, Mary and the newly arrived women processed the captured grain bags. They sifted the snowmelt-dampened rye and barley into freshly fired earthenware jars, while another woman turned our heavy stone mill to grind fine flour. Meanwhile, I led our captured northern pony outside. The night before, I had sheltered the animal inside my cabin to protect it from freezing, but the resulting mess and stench reinforced my decision to build a proper stable immediately. I instructed the builders to choose a sheltered spot protected from direct winds. Lucy delighted in feeding the pony oats from her hand, admiring the animal as a symbol of our settlement's martial strength. By noon, I wrapped up a grueling combat training session with Oliver. Relieved of heavy manual chores, he had spent the entire morning drilling with his spear and practicing parries. Though exhausted and sweating in the snow, the boy showed fierce determination to master the skills needed to survive on the battlefield. At lunchtime, Mary distributed food to our workers. Each laborer received half a piece of hard rye bread and a full bowl of hot bone broth with rendered fat. For serfs accustomed to starvation and harsh neglect, this warm, nourishing meal was an extraordinary luxury, and they ate with deep gratitude. Beside the stone hearth, Oliver and I ate pan-fried wild boar tenderloin to replenish our energy from training. As a reward for his management and battlefield service, I gave Thomas's family 2 extra portions of rich pork. Honored by this recognition of his elevated status, Thomas stood tall with pride. I instructed him to finish his meal quickly and supervise the placement of the stable beams throughout the afternoon. After a quick lunch, Thomas rallied the laborers back to work. Using our captured Danish axes, they hauled heavy pine logs and notched the main pillars to support the roof beams. By sunset, a sturdy timber frame was erected in the courtyard, featuring 4 deep-set pine posts and interlocking oak rafters, large enough to shelter our pony and future draft animals. Realizing that a task that previously took days was completed in mere hours, I was reminded once again that an expanding population was our most valuable resource. I instructed Oliver and the men to line the compacted earth inside the stable with a half-foot layer of dry oat straw. I personally led our captured northern pony into its new shelter. Smelling the fresh bedding, the animal snorted in satisfaction and settled into the warm hay. During dinner, as the new arrivals gathered around their campfire to eat their rye porridge, I approached them to gather intelligence. When asked about their origins, the elderly farmer stepped forward on behalf of the group. He explained that they came from the Green Valley region belonging to Baron Thorpe, located 2 to 3 days away by oxcart. Invading forces had overrun the area the previous month, torching stone manors, capturing surrounding markets, and forcing villagers to haul looted grain southward. His report confirmed that enemy raiding parties were systematically combing northern Mercia for provisions. The old farmer spoke with rare composure, clear logic, and detailed geographic awareness. Upon questioning him, he introduced himself as Godwin, revealing that he had served 5 years as a garrison guard on a baron's estate before an injury led him to become a village reeve. Finding a seasoned veteran capable of organizing labor and managing logistics was an extraordinary asset. While Thomas was fiercely loyal, his limited perspective made him prone to overly harsh supervision. Godwin possessed the ideal background to mediate between the laborers and the leadership. I appointed Godwin as Thomas's deputy, tasking him with maintaining order and maximizing productivity among the new serfs. Godwin bowed low with deep sincerity, accepting the duty to keep the workers disciplined and focused. Over the following days, the division of labor between Thomas and Godwin created a highly effective routine. Thomas managed the heavy timber cutting and exerted firm discipline with his axe and rugged authority, while Godwin used his experience as an elder to assign tasks according to each worker's physical strength and skills. By balancing strict enforcement with small food rewards, the refugees quickly adjusted to an organized work schedule. Before the next blizzard arrived, the new stable was completed. Larger than my original cabin, it featured deep pine posts, sturdy crossbeams, and thick walls sealed with straw-reinforced red clay to block the freezing winds. Inside, the floor was cushioned with a foot of dry oat straw and equipped with an oak feed trough. Lucy brushed the northern pony, which settled comfortably into the warm shelter. Thomas proudly pointed out that, following my instructions, the stable included 2 extra partitioned stalls, ready to house the draft oxen or horses I planned to acquire for spring plowing. However, the rapid growth of our settlement brought a critical public health issue. On my morning patrol, I discovered foul human waste, food scraps, and rotting straw scattered across the snow near the cabin. Accustomed to crude peasant habits, the newcomers treated open ground as a natural toilet. I was utterly disgusted. More critically, I knew that poor sanitation in a growing community bred dysentery, typhus, and deadly plagues that could wipe out all 16 of us in an era devoid of modern medicine. I immediately summoned Thomas and Godwin to address the filthy conditions. When Thomas dismissed the waste as harmless manure, I cut him off with strict orders. I decreed that anyone caught relieving themselves within the compound or near the living quarters would lose their entire bread ration for the day. I ordered Thomas to lead 2 men to the furthest downwind point on the compound perimeter to dig a 2-meter deep latrine pit, fit it with log footings, and enclose it with a straw privacy fence. Simultaneously, I instructed Godwin to mobilize Mary and the women to sweep every scrap of refuse, discarded bone, and soiled straw from the yard. Under my firm orders, the men broke through the frozen soil to dig the latrine, while the women swept the snow clean. Watching order and cleanliness return to the stronghold, I felt relieved. knowing our outpost was protected against both external enemies and internal disease. Digging through the frozen ground for our latrine pit proved slow and grueling. While the men worked, I inspected our clay jars with Oliver and established a strict rule: all water for drinking and cooking had to be thoroughly boiled until bubbling. Anyone caught drinking raw water straight from the mountain stream would face severe penalties, including stable duty and withheld rations. To support our expanding population without overwhelming the indoor hearth, Oliver and his helpers constructed an outdoor fire pit with river stones and suspended clay jars for boiling water. By mid-afternoon, the 2-meter-deep pit was finished. The crew placed 2 sturdy foot logs across the top and enclosed the structure with a thatched privacy screen. Thomas was puzzled by the effort. Assuming waste should simply be scattered as manure, I explained the lethal danger of invisible sicknesses like cholera and dysentery, which spread rapidly through unmanaged waste and could wipe out all 16 of us. To preserve the waste for practical use, I ordered that the contents be regularly transferred into an adjacent composting trench. I instructed Thomas to mix in straw, soil, discarded organic waste, dry leaves, and a basket of wood ash from the hearth every morning. Over several months, this mixture would break down into rich, safe fertilizer for our fields. Understanding the direct benefit to soil fertility, Thomas embraced the task with genuine excitement. I assembled the entire community by the new latrine to announce the rules. I declared that maintaining order and sanitation was mandatory across House Aquila's lands, and anyone caught relieving themselves elsewhere would forfeit their daily bread. Thomas loudly backed my command, warning the workers against any disobedience. By dusk, Mary and the women had swept every scrap of filth, animal bone, and spoiled straw from the yard, exposing clean earth. While the serfs viewed my strict hygiene rules as noble eccentricities, I knew proper sanitation was the only way to prevent winter disease from destroying our settlement. Outside the cabin, Mary simmered a large communal pot of thick rye paste enriched with bran, bone marrow, and meat scraps. I ensured the portions were hearty, providing full servings and even extra half scoops for the strongest laborers. I knew that starving workers could never clear heavy soil or plow 10 acres come spring. For the first time in years, our workers ate until their bellies were full and their strength was fully restored. Breaking the serfs' lifelong habit of relieving themselves wherever they pleased proved harder than teaching them to fight. Despite my explicit rules, visible stains continued to spoil the snow near our living quarters. At daybreak, Godwin and Oliver caught a young laborer named Gary urinating right beside the fence instead of walking to the latrine. When Gary made excuses about the freezing cold and dismissed the health risks as trivial peasant business, Godwin firmly cut off the entire household's bread rations for the day. Stepping out of my cabin, I heard the commotion and intervened with an additional punishment. To reinforce the lesson, I ordered Oliver to give Gary 2 wooden shovels, commanding the young man to clear every trace of soiled snow within 10 paces of the outpost under the threat of losing his breakfast the following morning as well. I knew that explaining modern concepts of bacteria, contamination, and epidemic disease to illiterate peasants was completely futile. In their worldview, illness was simply fate or a divine curse. The only language they truly understood was the enforcement of authority, the pangs of hunger, and leading by visible example. To turn this hygiene standard into an unquestioned rule, I made a point of using the thatched latrine openly in full view of the settlement. After finishing, I gathered cooled wood ash from the basket, spread it over the waste, and layered dry oak leaves on top. Oliver, Thomas, and Godwin followed my exact routine. Seeing the knight and the overseers adhere to the process transformed the chore into an established ritual of authority and discipline. The enforcement produced immediate results. After a grueling day of clearing snow on an empty stomach, Gary ran straight to the designated latrine the next morning without needing any reminder. The other serfs quickly adopted the same habit, lining up at the deep pit and covering their waste with ash and leaves. Seeing the courtyard clean, dry, and free of filth gave our people an unexpected sense of pride and dignity. By curbing their basic habits, we took the essential first step toward true organizational discipline. Furthermore, the fermenting compost safely neutralized the risk of winter disease, while steadily accumulating rich fertilizer for our upcoming spring plowing. As the southerly winds began to melt the deep winter snow The valley floor turned into a damp, muddy expanse. Knowing the moisture would quickly rust my armor, I remained vigilant with maintenance. Inside the cabin, our 5 rescued pheasants, now fully grown, plump, and noisy, signaled that it was time to move them outside. I ordered Thomas and 2 new laborers to build a sturdy wooden coop next to the stable. Tracing a 4-foot square in the mud with my sword sheath, I outlined a structure large enough for future expansion. Once the frame and thatched roof were secured, Mary brought the birds out. After a brief chase with a rebellious rooster, all 5 pheasants were safely housed. They were the first assets in my territory capable of producing eggs and protein, which I planned to use both for sustenance and as rewards for diligent workers. With the snow clearing, the dark, fertile soil of our 2-acre rye field was finally exposed. Eager to secure their livelihood, the newly arrived serfs gathered at the field's edge at dawn. Though none of them owned the land, the simple promise of working safely without fear of Viking raids filled them with intense motivation. They pulled weeds and cleared stones with their bare hands, waiting for my command to begin clearing. Looking south toward the untouched wasteland, I knew our current fields were entirely insufficient to support 16 people. In this era, inefficient farming methods and low crop yields meant that feeding a single person required 3 to 5 acres of land. Furthermore, typical serfs lost massive portions of their harvests to lords and church tithes, leaving them starving during poor seasons. In my valley, however, things would be different. I abolished the division between the lord's private land and tenant plots. Instead, I established a centralized system where I controlled all agricultural planning, planting, and harvesting. Every grain produced would go directly into my storehouse, ensuring no tithes were lost and no one starved from poor winter planning. While I knew this communal system could eventually breed laziness on a larger scale, our settlement of 16 was small enough that I could easily monitor everyone's effort. Standing before the cabin, I prepared to mobilize my workforce to conquer the wasteland and expand our fields. Under standard medieval methods, low crop yields and heavy exploitation meant an adult needed 3 acres of land just to survive. In my territory, I intended to rewrite those numbers completely. By eliminating nobleman taxes and church tithes, we immediately retained far more grain. More importantly, using advanced agricultural techniques would dramatically boost our soil fertility and crop yields. Using charcoal and a smooth wooden board, I drew an agricultural map to explain my strategy to Oliver. I showed him the benefits of structured drill sowing over scattered broadcasting. By planting in spaced, aerated rows with seeds buried 3 fingers deep, crops would receive optimal sunlight while reducing choking weeds. Next, I introduced a 3-field crop rotation system to replace the inefficient 2-field fallow method. I divided our arable land into 3 sections, one for spring rye, a second for broad beans and oats, and a third left fallow to be fertilized, limed with wood ash, and tilled 3 times before planting winter wheat in autumn. I explained to Oliver that broad bean root nodules naturally fix nitrogen into the soil, creating excellent natural fertilizer, combined with decomposed compost from our latrine. This intensive cultivation could push our seed-to-harvest ratio from 13 up to 110. Under this system, just 0.8 acres could sustain an adult, meaning 30 acres of cultivated land could easily feed 40 people and produce surplus grain to recruit future soldiers. I called Thomas over and ordered him to mobilize the workforce to clear 30 acres of southern wasteland. Having farmed under traditional low-yield methods his whole life, Thomas grew anxious, worrying that 30 acres would not produce enough food to prevent 16 people from starving through next winter. I reassured him that with proper drill sowing and our fermented compost, this plot would yield more grain than 3 conventional fields combined. Trusting my track record, Thomas put aside his doubts and accepted the command. With roughly 20 to 25 days remaining before spring planting, the heavy labor of clearing the land had to begin immediately. I excused Oliver from manual excavation so he could maintain his combat readiness and focus on martial duties as my squire. That left Thomas and the 5 new laborers to reclaim the entire 30 acres of root-choked, weed-covered wasteland on their own, requiring each man to clear 6 grueling acres before the planting window arrived. Clearing 30 acres of tangled wasteland by hand alone was impossible. The early spring soil was cold and muddy, and the tough weed roots would have exhausted our laborers before the planting season even started. The only practical solution was to use fire. A controlled burn would incinerate the dense surface brush, destroy dormant pests, and enrich Britain's acidic soil with fertile wood ash. The darkened, ash-covered ground would also absorb more heat to protect upcoming spring seedlings from late frosts. Before lighting anything, safety was paramount. I ordered Oliver and the men to dig wide fire breaks and drench the isolation zones with water from the stream. To the west, we scraped a 10-foot wide dirt path clean of roots. To the east, we used a wet, muddy ditch as a natural buffer. Along the northern ridge, the crew cleared extra space and removed dry debris. Thomas assembled bundles of water-soaked linen and damp pine boughs, placing them every 20 paces along the perimeter to quickly smother any escaping embers. Meanwhile, Oliver stood alert on a southern ridge with his hand on his sword, guarding against unexpected threats. Under an overcast, windless sky, I struck flint and tossed a burning bundle of dried grass into the brush. The yellowed tops caught immediately, while the damp root layers underneath produced a dense, churning blanket of yellow-black smoke. The low-intensity fire moved steadily across the wasteland, smoldering beneath the heavy haze and reducing the dense vegetation to fertile ash. Watching from an upwind rock, a surge of unease tempered my satisfaction. The thick plume of smoke rose high into the sky, making our position visible for miles. While wild animals would naturally flee from fire, I worried about roaming Viking raiders who might spot the signal from afar. Oliver remained motionless on high ground, his eyes fixed on the southern forest for any signs of enemy scouts. Realizing the burn could not be reversed, I pushed my worries aside. Our best course was to finish the clearing, plow the 30 acres, and fortify our settlement so we would be ready to defend our home against any invaders. The controlled burn moved southward, slowing down at the edge of the meadow, while our fire breaks successfully halted the flames to the east and west. Thomas and his men patrolled the perimeter with wet burlap sacks and damp pine boughs, quickly smothering any stray embers that drifted across the lines. The fire was well under control, but my tension remained high. From his vantage point on the slope, Oliver alerted me that he had spotted a shadowy figure at the edge of the southern forest through the haze. By the time I turned to look, the figure had vanished into the trees. I ordered Oliver to keep his eyes fixed on the tree line and report any movement immediately while I supervised the remainder of the burn. Once the fire subsided, Thomas confirmed that the boundaries held and all workers were accounted for. Walking across the scorched ground, I found the soil pleasantly warm and loose, the hard surface crust successfully broken down by the heat. I instructed Thomas to have the workers clear out burned stones the following morning, while leaving the fertile ashes in place. I also assigned night sentries to watch the field, so hidden embers would not reignite in the wind. At dusk, we returned to camp, knowing that heavy field labor required substantial nourishment. I increased our daily meals to 3 servings, complete with rye bread, vegetable soup, and extra rations of smoked meat. While the workers ate by the fire, I quietly informed Thomas of the possible scout spotted to the south. Though startled, he kept his voice down to avoid alarming the camp. I told him that whether the stranger was an enemy raider or a wandering refugee, we had to investigate before they threatened our valley. After night fell and the sentries were posted, Oliver, Thomas, and I geared up for a night reconnaissance patrol. I donned my long-sleeve chainmail and distributed 3 unlit resin torches, while Oliver carried his iron-tipped spear and Thomas brought his leather shield and axe. Moving silently in the dark across the still warm ashes, we crossed our 30-acre field to scout the southern woods and uncover what was lurking beyond our borders. The southern woods were cold, damp, and dripping with snowmelt as we stepped under the canopy and lit our torches. Oliver took the lead, scanning the shadows, while I followed with my hand resting on my sword hilt, and Thomas brought up the rear. While wild game or hungry wolves were normal threats, our real fear was that roaming Viking raiders had spotted our daytime smoke plume. Oliver soon signaled a halt, shining his torch on a fresh trail of crushed ferns and disturbed, decaying leaves. We followed the trail 40 paces deeper into the forest, where the track widened into a shallow ditch of churned mud. The spacing and depth indicated a group of 3 or 4 people marching in formation. Near a fallen log, Oliver discovered a waist-high scratch where freshly peeled bark revealed bare wood, likely caused by a back-slung round shield or an axe. Moments later, Thomas pointed out distinct bare human footprints pressed into the mud. In this region, hardened seafarers, accustomed to long ships, were the only ones who traveled barefoot through freezing woods. Oliver noted that the tracks headed southeast. Knowing that route led down to a stream with a sheltered hollow against a rocky cliff, I realized it was an ideal hidden campsite. Recognizing that our bright torches made us easy targets for an enemy hiding in the dark, I ordered our flames extinguished immediately. We plunged our torches into the wet mud and waited for our eyes to adjust to the dim gray light filtering through the treetops. Moving cautiously in complete silence, we crept along the trail for another 15 minutes as the terrain sloped downward. The damp air soon carried the scent of running water. Halting behind a row of trees near the bank, we looked across the stream toward the rocky wall. There, nestled in a hidden pit surrounded by stones, a concealed fire flickered faintly against the rock face, casting dim yellow light over several moving silhouettes. Creeping through the undergrowth, we reached the narrow stream and observed the campsite across the water. 4 people lay curled around a modest campfire against the rock face, all sound asleep without a single sentry posted. The complete lack of guards struck me as deeply suspicious. Given the daytime smoke, experienced raiders would never leave their campsite unmonitored, unless it was a deliberate ambush. I signaled Oliver and Thomas to scout our flanks. Both returned quickly, confirming that the surrounding woods to the left and right were clear. Realizing 4 sleeping men were too small, a group to serve as raider bait, I decided to act before they vanished by morning. Drawing my arming sword, I led my men across the shallow, freezing stream in a swift charge. As I closed in on the sleeping figure nearest the hearth, the person sat up abruptly. The blanket fell away, revealing a thin face framed by a coarse wool robe, a rope belt, and a worn wooden cross. He immediately began shouting curses in Saxon, condemning us as pagans. Hearing his native tongue, I checked my downward strike, resting the flat steel against his neck to demand his identity. The man squinted through the flickering firelight, his eyes widening in disbelief as he recognized me. He cried out my name with joy, examining his gaunt, dirt-streaked face. I recognized him as Monk Bjorn, the same ascetic brother, who had swung the incense burner during my knighting ceremony years ago. I sheathed my blade and signaled Oliver and Thomas to stand down. The 3 startled figures behind the monk relaxed as well. When I asked Bjorn how he had ended up wandering through this remote wilderness, his expression darkened with grief. He explained that the northern lands had collapsed completely after the Viking invasion. His monastery had been burned to the ground, forcing surviving brothers to flee south toward Mercia. He initially sought refuge in Nottingham, assisting with church duties while Mercian garrisons defended the ramparts. However, the great heathen army led by Ivar and Halfdan launched a surprise night assault, overwhelming the defenders and torching the church before dawn. Following the fall of Nottingham, King Burgred of Mercia sent urgent appeals southward to Wessex. In response, King Ethelred of Wessex and his younger brother Alfred marched north with their combined armies, laying siege to the captured city. Thomas asked about the outcome of the siege, and Bjorn explained that the Allied forces had reached a stalemate outside Nottingham. In the end, King Burgred of Mercia paid a large sum of tribute to buy peace, prompting the Viking army to withdraw back to York. Bjorn had escaped the city on the day it fell, taking 3 orphaned young men with him, a blacksmith's apprentice, a church handyman, and a miller's son. Intending to head toward the remote west to avoid enemy patrols, they had completely lost their sense of direction in the dense woods and mistakenly wandered northeast to my valley. Spotting the thick smoke from our daytime field burn, Bjorn had climbed a ridge to observe. He saw armed men around the flames and kept his distance in fear until our encounter. Learning they were not enemies, the lingering tension of the night finally faded. I asked about the scratch we had discovered on the tree trunk along the trail. In response, Bjorn signaled the apprentice, who dragged out a large cloth bundle stitched from coarse linen. Untying the ropes, they revealed a remarkable hoard of salvaged tools: hammers, iron chisels, iron bars, nails, axes, a saw, replacement handles, salt, a cooking pot, fishing gear, and sickles. The 4 of them had walked barefoot for dozens of miles through the freezing forest, carrying over 100 pounds of precious metal tools on their backs, without being ambushed by raiders, bandits, or wolves. Their survival was an astonishing stroke of luck. Recognizing the immense value of their tools and skills, I told them to rest by the hearth and invited them to return with us to my stronghold at daybreak. We settled down around the expanded fire to rest after an exhausting day. Even though Bjorn was an old acquaintance, I refused to let down our guard in the untamed wilderness. Leaving a camp unwatched was an invitation to slaughter. I organized a strict night watch rotation among my men, assigning Oliver the first 1-hour shift, followed by myself, and then Thomas. As Oliver took up his position facing the dark tree line, the 4 exhausted travelers quickly fell into a deep sleep, and I rested with my arming sword within immediate reach. Oliver woke me for my night watch, and I stood guard with my back to the dying fire, watching the quiet, mist-covered woods. An hour later, Thomas relieved me under the gray moonlight, allowing me to sleep soundly until daybreak. At dawn, the forest was shrouded in cold mist and the smell of damp ash. Oliver was washing his face in the creek, while Thomas nodded by the hearth. I nudged Bjorn awake, telling him to gather his companions so we could head back to our camp. We crossed the 30-acre field of scorched, ash-covered soil. Seeing the thatched huts and cooking smoke beneath the northern ridge, the 3 town-bred youths reacted with immense relief. The blacksmith's apprentice grinned under his heavy tool bag, while the miller's son openly marveled that a lord could maintain such an estate amidst the Viking invasions. Oliver puffed out his chest with pride at the praise. Bjorn gave me a searching, suspicious look, silently wondering how a knight originating from Northumbria came to control land in Mercia. Unfazed, I stated that it was a knight's sacred duty to defend holy land and God's people from invaders. Bjorn conceded with a sigh, addressing me as Lord Adrian, which earned admiring glances from the young men behind us. Arriving at the outpost, I instructed Mary to prepare breakfast portions for 4 more people. The serfs, drying their boots by the fire, looked up, their eyes immediately locking onto the wooden cross hanging against Bjorn's tattered, muddy robe. I stopped before the crowd and formally announced that all 4 men were joining our settlement, specifically introducing Bjorn as an ordained monk. The courtyard fell into reverent silence. Overwhelmed with emotion, an elder serf stood and bowed deeply to the monk. Bjorn cleaned his wooden cross, clasped his hands, and offered a gentle blessing to the crowd. Starved for spiritual solace after months of fleeing brutality, our people crossed their chests in prayer, weeping with gratitude at the sacred words they had not heard in so long. The arrival of a monk stirred quiet excitement among our serfs. Hearing them whisper about prayers and a future church, I told them to focus on the fields first. I promised that after the spring planting, I would allocate land in the center of the estate to build a chapel. This assurance brought immediate comfort to our people. Bjorn asked about the absence of a church, and I reminded him that our own cabins had only just been roofed. Seeing the 4 newcomers shivering, Mary added dried smoked fish to the boiling soup to stretch the morning meal. To establish spiritual routine, I instructed Bjorn to lead the community in daily morning prayer before breakfast. As he raised his cleaned wooden cross to pray, the serfs bowed their heads and reverently made the sign of the cross. After breakfast, I ordered Oliver to take the 4 men to the river to wash away the trail grime and help them make straw sandals for their bare feet. Hearing their faint prayers outside, I returned to the cabin to plan our next steps. When the men returned clean and presentable, I inspected each of them. My attention settled on the blacksmith's apprentice, who looked about 16 or 17, but possessed large, heavily calloused hands. He introduced himself as Edmund. I asked him to open his heavy bundle of iron tools and raw materials. Picking up a solid iron bar from the stash, I questioned his blacksmithing experience. Edmund grew confident, explaining that he could forge all standard farm tools, such as hoes, sickles, plows, and horseshoes. He could also craft simple weapons, including axes, arrowheads, and spearheads, and had memorized the quenching process for knightly swords from his former master. When I asked if he could forge battle armor, Edmund hesitated and admitted his limitations. He explained that crafting chainmail was too delicate, requiring thousands of interlocking iron rings, though he had observed his master repair damaged mail in Nottingham. Even with that limitation, discovering a skilled smith capable of producing essential agricultural implements and basic weaponry was an extraordinary boon for our growing territory. I encouraged Edmund, pointing out that crafting basic farm tools and spearheads was exactly what our growing settlement needed right now. Showing him the broken rings and makeshift vine bindings on Oliver's damaged chainmail, I asked if he could repair the armor. Edmund examined the mail confidently, promising he could reforge the damaged links and hammer everything back into shape. Delighted by his skill, I promised to build him his own dedicated blacksmith shed. In response, Edmund reached deep into his heavy burlap pack and pulled out a solid iron anvil, an invaluable keepsake saved from his fallen master in Nottingham. I instructed him to gather timber with Thomas immediately, so we could raise the forge without delay. Next, I interviewed the miller's son. To my surprise, he proudly announced that he knew practical mathematics. He explained that his name was Arno, and he had learned arithmetic, basic multiplication, and inventory tracking while helping his father run the grain mill. Finding someone literate in basic accounting was an incredible rarity in 9th century England. I appointed Arno as our estate storekeeper, tasking him with cataloging all our accumulated dried meats, grain sacks, leather, nails, and raw supplies. Finally, I examined the young church helper standing beside Bjorn. Once the road grime was washed away, I realized the helper was actually a disguised young woman, with narrow shoulders and delicate features. Bjorn explained that she had escaped the burning city of Nottingham after the parish priest was lost. She introduced herself as Elisa, explaining that she knew how to mend clothing, maintain church linens, and prepare meals. I sent her directly to Mary to help cook, sew, and handle household chores, while Bjorn reminded me with a sly smile not to forget our future church. I mentally calculated the new state of our settlement. The 4 newcomers brought specialized skills in metallurgy, bookkeeping, and housekeeping, but they also added 4 more mouths to feed without directly contributing to heavy field labor. With our food reserves draining quickly from 3 meals a day, our most urgent priority remained clearing the 30 acres of scorched wasteland for spring rye before worrying about any chapel. I sent Thomas into the dense woods to assist Edmund in gathering timber for the new forge. At first, Thomas grew impatient as the young blacksmith spent nearly an hour inspecting individual trees instead of chopping immediately. However, Thomas understood the vital importance of having a dedicated blacksmith in our settlement. In standard villages, farmers often waited weeks for a traveling smith just to repair dull sickles and broken hoes. More importantly, our territory needed weapons. To defend our land against future Viking raids, every able-bodied man would eventually need an iron spearhead forged right here. Edmund examined each tree with professional precision. He rejected one large oak after spotting borer holes in the roots, explaining that infested wood would crack and cause the entire workshop to collapse under the heat of the forge. He also turned down a straight ash tree because a wind-damaged crown created invisible internal fractures. When Thomas jokingly asked if he was selecting timber for a grand cathedral, Edmund replied that a forge required flawless construction to keep heavy beams from collapsing on his head. Eventually, Edmund approved a massive oak for structural support and sound ash wood for crafting tool handles and bellows levers. When Thomas asked about the layout of the workshop, Edmund drew a detailed blueprint in the dirt with a twig. He mapped out a square structure with 8-foot pillars and sloped rafters for drainage. He placed the hearth on the south wall with an optimized flue to prevent smoke backdrafts in shifting winds. He positioned the anvil toward the east, where morning sunlight would illuminate the glowing iron, allowing him to gauge heating temperatures accurately. He placed the bellows along the west wall to catch natural cross breezes and added external drainage ditches to keep dampness from ruining the quenching process. When Thomas asked how he possessed such detailed knowledge, Edmund quietly revealed that he was recreating the exact workshop of his fallen master in Nottingham, where he had lived his entire life. Respecting the young apprentice's dedication and memories, Thomas raised his axe and returned to work without another word, chopping the timber needed to bring our forge to life. While mapping out the layout on the ground, Edmund shared the story of his escape with Thomas. On the day Nottingham fell, as raiders breached the eastern walls, his master Berengar pushed him into the cellar with raw iron bars. Berengar handed him the anvil and commanded him to run through the back door without ever looking back. He then bolted the shop door from within, facing the attackers alone. Edmund fled with the tools on his back and the anvil in his arms, hiding in the woods through the burning night before joining Bjorn, Elisa, and Arno. To transport the heavy timber from the woods, Thomas called several serfs over to assist, while Arno and Elisa brought ropes. Together, they carried the logs to the designated workshop plot. Once the wood was gathered, Thomas sent the serfs back to their land-clearing tasks, leaving the construction of the smithy to himself and Edmund. Edmund dug post holes 2 hand spans deep at each corner of the planned structure. Working together, he and Thomas hoisted the thick oak posts into the holes, packing and tamping down the soil firmly layer by layer until all 4 pillars stood securely. Next, they raised 2 heavy crossbeams across the top, binding the joints with thick hemp rope and reinforcing the structural intersections with iron nails. With the main timber skeleton erect, the foundation for our valley's first true forging workshop was officially set. Exhausted and bruised from hauling heavy logs all day, Thomas asked Edmund to repair his favorite pickaxe once the forge was running. I had originally given Thomas that tool, but after months of clearing roots and stones, its handle had become loose and its iron tip dull. Edmund assured him that he would fit the tool with a resilient ash handle, anneal the tip, and re-quench the metal to make it as good as new. Thomas smiled with satisfaction, pointing out that unlike the itinerant blacksmiths of the past who charged fees and left, Edmund was now our Lord's resident blacksmith. Before heading back to camp for the evening, Thomas confirmed the 3-foot dimensions of the hearth and the position of the flue, promising to return at daybreak to help build the stone furnace. Because of our severe labor shortage, we quickly threw together 4 crude thatched shelters next to the old cabin for our 4 newcomers. The mud walls were still damp and rough, and simple linen curtains served as doors. When I checked on Bjorn, he expressed genuine contentment, noting that a dry roof and a bed of hay were far better than the freezing ditches and infested pens he had endured while fleeing south. Before letting the curtain drop, he cheerfully reminded me not to forget my promise of land for a church after the spring planting. Nearby, Arno and Elisa mixed wet mud with grass clippings to seal the drafty gaps in their walls, while Edmund placed his precious tool bag right beside his bed. Over the next few days, Edmund and Thomas worked along the riverbank to prepare the materials for the forge. Edmund selected quality clay from the base of a north-facing slope, picking out every weed root and pebble before Thomas carried the soil back in wicker baskets. Edmund also hand-selected flat, hard river stones to construct the forge base. Working together, they completed the workshop structure in just a few days. The roof was securely covered with 2 overlapping layers of tree bark to channel rainwater away, and the floor was raised, compacted, and surrounded by gravel-lined drainage ditches. Inside, they constructed a 3-foot square stone hearth with a bottom air intake and a southern wall flue venting out under the eaves. Edmund laid out the tools he had salvaged from his master's shop: his hammers, file, iron chisels, pliers, nails, iron bars, and the Nottingham anvil. However, after taking inventory of the empty shed, he realized the workshop was still missing 3 critical pieces of equipment: a leather bellows, a quenching tub, and a proper sharpening whetstone. Without bellows to force air into the hearth, the charcoal fire could not reach the high temperatures required to heat iron billets to glowing red. Without a dedicated water tub, newly forged tools could not be quenched and hardened, leaving their edges brittle or soft. Finally, without a large abrasive whetstone, dull sickles and damaged hoes could not be ground to a sharp working edge. Edmund had carried every small hand tool he could during the fall of Nottingham, but the bulky bellows, heavy wooden tub, and massive stone slab were impossible for one person to carry on the run. When Thomas and Edmund reported our missing forge equipment, I provided immediate solutions. For the bellows, I handed over a thick, tanned wild boar hide, left over from our winter hunt. For the quenching tub, I allocated a large ceramic storage pot, instructing Edmund to make do with water quenching until I could source oil. Finally, I directed them to use my sturdy wooden wheelbarrow to haul a suitable whetstone from the riverbank. Edmund and Thomas searched downstream until Edmund discovered an ideal blue-gray stone partially buried in the riverbed. It was smooth, dense, and stood half a person tall, ensuring it would not wear down quickly under heavy tool sharpening. Calling Arno over to assist, the 3 men wrestled the massive slab out of the mud and hoisted it onto the wheelbarrow platform. Thomas carefully maneuvered the cart uphill and down the slopes, with Edmund bracing the front crossbar and Arno stabilizing the heavy stone to keep it from tipping. My hand-built wheelbarrow held up perfectly under the extreme weight, without cracking an axle. Upon reaching the workshop, they unloaded the stone firmly against the wall near the entrance, and Edmund tapped it with a small chisel to confirm its fine quality. With the heavy hauling finished, Edmund stayed behind in the workshop to begin constructing the bellows alone. Making a functional bellows was a precise craft that could not be rushed. He selected seasoned oak boards, preparing to fashion the two outer plates, the central air bladder from the bore leather, the operating lever, and the critical one-way air intake valves. Every surface required precise planing, airtight stitching, and balanced lever alignment to ensure smooth airflow into the furnace without tearing the leather. Inside the newly framed workshop, Edmund meticulously filed and smoothed the edges of the oak boards so no air would leak from the bellows. He cut the planks carefully, meeting both saw cuts in the center for clean, even joints. Next, he laid out the thick wild boar hide, tracing the precise pattern for the folding air bladder. Recalling the lessons of his master in Nottingham, he used a hammer handle to pre-press 4 deep crease lines into the hide, ensuring the tough leather would fold cleanly and never crack under repeated pumping. Because the hide was too thick for ordinary needles, he set the leather aside to punch stitching holes later once the wooden frame and lever were built. After tidying his tools, he fell asleep inside the workshop, planning to search the woods the next day for light linden wood to carve the intake valve. Meanwhile, lacking a dedicated carpenter or tanner, I personally worked on crafting a powerful short bow for Oliver. I retrieved seasoned ash wood that had been drying by the stove until it cured to a rich beeswax color without any cracks. Pairing the solid stave with a resilient bowstring twisted from dried wolf sinew, I focused on adding long-range combat capability to our settlement. Our community had grown to 20 people, all performing essential daily tasks. Bjorn led prayers. Edmund managed the forge. Elisa helped Mary with cooking and sewing. Arno tallied grain stores. Lucy tended the fields, and the serfs maintained the perimeter. Yet out of 20 mouths to feed, I remained the only fully capable archer and frontline combatant. Oliver was dedicated but still stiff in his swordplay. Thomas lacked balance when swinging his axe, and the serfs had spent their entire lives behind plows rather than shields. I knew our current peace was fragile. The Viking retreat from Nottingham back to York was merely temporary while they pacified Northumbria. Once the north fell completely, their forces would turn south toward East Anglia and Mercia. Foreseeing the inevitable political fractures in Wessex upon the king's death, I knew Mercia would soon be left isolated and vulnerable. Before that wave of devastation reached our hidden valley, I was determined to train my followers and forge the weapons needed to meet any invader with deadly arrows and unyielding steel. With the bellows pumping and the fire roaring, our new blacksmith shop was officially in business. I sat down with Edmund by the door to clearly define his position. I explained that because the timber, charcoal, and land came from my estate, he was not an independent renter, but the private craftsman of my territory. His duties were to forge and repair farm implements, craft spearheads and arrowheads for the men, shoe my horse, and maintain our weapons and armor. In return, I guaranteed him food, lodging, and future wages once our harvests prospered, treating him with the respect due to a skilled artisan rather than a common serf. Edmund gladly agreed, stepping inside to reforge the damaged links on Oliver's chainmail as the rhythmic sound of his hammer echoed along the riverbank. Meanwhile, our most critical task was spring planting. Although our controlled burn had loosened the soil and charred stubborn roots, manually tilling 30 acres with our small workforce was simply too slow. Even with women like Mary and Elisa working tirelessly behind the men to clear stones and pull weeds, we could not finish before the planting window closed. Lacking draft oxen, I decided to harness our captured northern pony to a plow. These hardy ponies possessed immense endurance and could plow even faster than oxen if harnessed properly. Because we lacked agricultural gear for horses, I set out to construct a lightweight, acute angled wooden plow on the spot. I selected a birch log naturally curved at 60 degrees, chopping and shaping the end into a sharp wedge-like plowshare. I held the wooden point over the fire to fire harden the tip, making the charred wood 3 times more durable against frozen soil and underground stones. Next, to prevent the harness from strangling the horse's throat, I had Oliver wrap dry oat straw around tough hemp ropes and sheath the padding in soft scraps of boar leather. This improvised collar allowed the pony to push forward safely with its broad chest muscles. We hitched the newly assembled three-beam wooden plow behind the pony. Taking the reins, I led the horse into the southern wasteland. As the pony surged forward, the fire-hardened wooden plowshare sliced deep into the ash-covered earth, tearing through the mud mounds with ease. Our initial plowing attempt, with the primitive straight-shaft plow, proved deeply frustrating. The heavy birch frame dragged awkwardly through the muddy ground, shuddering and bouncing violently whenever the wooden point struck tough, unburnt roots. The impact sent jarring shocks through Thomas's arms, while our northern pony struggled and stumbled under the uneven resistance. The resulting furrows were shallow and irregular, and turning the rigid, heavy plow at the end of each row required exhausting manual lifting. I called a halt to spare both the exhausted horse and Thomas's aching shoulders. Inspecting the tool, I found hairline fractures along the fire-hardened tip, while I envisioned an advanced curved shaft plow with a proper iron plowshare. Edmund's limited supply of raw iron had to be reserved for critical weapons, armor repairs, and essential tools. I decided to build the wooden frame of a curved shaft plow first, using an optimized fire-hardened wooden point, until we could forge iron components. Back at the cabin, I sketched the new design on the floor with charcoal. Thomas suggested bending straight timber over a fire, but I corrected him. Artificially heating wood made the fibers brittle and prone to snapping under heavy strain. Instead, I instructed him to find naturally curved ash branches that had twisted toward the sunlight along rock crevices, which offered natural flexibility and strength. At daybreak, Thomas returned with 3 naturally curved ash logs. Using a short axe and a file, I carefully carved the main curved beam along the wood grain, ensuring the stress points were smooth and burr-free. We fashioned a sturdy, straight plow bed from solid oak and built an ergonomic handle tailored to Thomas's height. For the critical plow disc mechanism, I chiseled a round oak disc, fitted it precisely onto the beam, and lubricated the joint with lard so it could rotate smoothly without wobbling. By noon, the new curved shaft plow was fully assembled. We harnessed the rested pony with our padded leather collar and tested the implement in the field. The difference was immediate. The curved shaft naturally pressed the blade into the earth at an optimal angle, cleanly slicing half an inch deeper and rolling neat, even soil layers over the surface ashes. Best of all, when we reached the edge of the plot, Thomas simply tilted the handle. The rotating disc turned effortlessly with the horse, carving a smooth arc without requiring anyone to lift the heavy frame. Thomas watched in amazement as the innovative plow turned around entirely on its own. Standing at the edge of the field, I watched our northern pony easily pull the new curved shaft plow through the dark, rich soil. The implement worked even better than expected, turning clean furrows without straining Thomas's shoulders. Nearby, Lucy gathered stones, Bjorn led quiet prayers, and rhythmic clanging from the forge signaled that Edmund was repairing Oliver's chainmail. Because a horse could only manage about half an acre a day, I told Thomas to pace the work so neither the animal nor the workers burned out. At dusk, we gathered outside the cabin to celebrate our progress. We had plowed nearly 2 acres of the northern plot without exhausting our workforce. To reward everyone's hard work, I ordered Mary and Elisa to serve extra portions of hearty boar stew. I reminded the serfs that steady teamwork over the next 10 days would complete our 10-acre goal and secure our autumn grain. Deeply moved by the generous meal and manageable labor, the workers praised the new plow and renewed their devotion to the estate. After dinner, Bjorn approached me quietly, asking how I had invented a design never before seen across Mercia or the monasteries. Recognizing the power of faith in this superstitious age, I claimed that the concept came to me in a nocturnal vision. I told him a heavenly light had shown me the curved ash wood and rotating disc, so our vulnerable settlement would not perish from exhaustion. Awestruck by my words, Bjorn took the story as a genuine divine revelation. He stood before the campfire, raised his wooden cross, and declared to the gathered serfs that God had chosen our valley, delivering the sacred plow design directly through me. When a young boy timidly asked if the tool truly came from heaven, Bjorn touched the cross to the child's forehead, swearing that the design was beyond human wisdom, and that every furrow plowed was a response to divine grace. As the serfs crossed themselves in reverent wonder, their fatigue transformed into sacred purpose. Bjorn returned to my side, pleased to have shared the miracle with the people. While I sent him off to rest for morning prayers, I reflected on the profound authority granted by religious devotion. In an era plagued by chaos and warfare, the belief in divine favor carried more weight than any weapon, binding my people with absolute loyalty for the trials ahead.